Section 1. The Galaxy Before Time. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a darkness so complete and so absolute that the word darkness doesn't even apply. Because darkness is only meaningful if there was once light. Before the first stars ignited, before the first hydrogen atoms collapsed under their own gravity, before anything we could recognize as matter had cooled into existence, there was something else out there, drifting through the impossible heat and the roiling energies of a universe not yet born, not thinking, exactly. Not conscious the way you or I understand consciousness, but present, aware in some terrible, vast alien sense of the word, feeding. These are the Satan, and before you can understand what the Necrons are trying to wake up, you first have to understand what the Catan actually are at the most fundamental level, because calling them gods or monsters or elder entities doesn't really do justice to how cosmically, incomprehensibly ancient these things are. We're not talking about beings who have simply lived for a very long time. We're talking about entities whose existence predates the formation of planets, predates the cooling of stars, predates, in some interpretations of the lore, any meaningful concept of organized matter at all. In the beginning of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, at the moment of creation itself, when unimaginable energies were first unleashed and the universe began its slow, violent expansion outward from that original churning singularity, something else was born alongside it. As stars began to coalesce from the vast clouds of hydrogen gas and cosmic dust, as gravity began its patient work of pulling matter together into those first brilliant burning spheres, the lines of electromagnetic force produced by these newborn suns generated something no one anticipated: consciousness, or at least something adjacent to it, something that fed, plus, moner. These were the Cetan, pure energy beings. Creatures of electromagnetic force who existed not as physical things but as vast, diffuse intelligences spread across the surfaces of stars, drinking in the radiation and heat, the light and fire and ancient power of these cosmic furnaces. In their natural state, they were essentially formless, not invisible so much as simply not comprehensible in terms that creatures of matter could parse. A Cetan in its true form might span a distance larger than a planet. Its thoughts would operate on timescales that made geological epochs look like seconds. It had no eyes to see with, no voice to speak with, no hands to reach out with. It simply was, coiled around a dying star, somewhere in the dark outer regions of a very young galaxy, feeding on solar flares and magnetic storms and the patient, constant output of nuclear fusion. For millions upon millions of years, that was all they did. They drifted, they fed. They barely perceived the material universe around them beyond the specific quality of whatever star they happened to be draining at any given moment. The planets spinning around those stars were essentially beneath their notice. Life, even if it had been present in the early galaxy, would have registered to a Cetan the way bacteria register to you when you walk through a doorway, not as prey, not as threat. Simply as nothing, background noise, the crackling irrelevance of matter that wasn't a star. It's important to sit with that image for a moment, because it's genuinely alien in a way that the 40,000 universe doesn't always get credit for. Most scary things in this setting are scary because they want something from you. Chaos wants your soul. Tyranids want your biomass. Even orcs want to fight. The Cetan at this primordial stage didn't want anything from life at all. They were simply too large, too ancient, too removed from the concerns of physical matter to even register its existence. They were not hostile. They were not friendly. They were geology, weather, a force of nature with awareness attached. What changed them was contact, and the story of that contact and everything that followed from it is one of the most consequential chains of events in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy. Because the moment the Cetan gained physical form, the moment they were given bodies that could interact with the material world directly, everything that we understand as the modern 40,000 universe was set in motion. The war in heaven, the shattered Cetan shards, the sleeping Necron tomb worlds, the fear of death hardwired into the collective unconscious of every intelligent species, the dragon beneath Mars. All of it traces back to that first contact between the dying and the deathless, between a species cursed with short lives and entities who had existed since before the first planets cooled. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The galaxy that the early Cetan inhabited was a very different place from the one we know in the 41st millennium. It was younger, quieter in some ways, though vastly more violent in others. The warp, that parallel dimension of psychic energy that underlies and mirrors the material universe, was in this early era comparatively calm. There were no chaos gods lurking in its depths, no daemons clawing at the membrane between dimensions, no great screaming wounds in reality like the Eye of Terror or the Cicatrix Maledictum. The warp was simply a sea of raw potential, reflecting the emotional and psychic state of the few conscious beings that existed. And since there were so few of those, and they were mostly the slow, contemplative Cetan who had no souls in any meaningful sense, the Imperium was peaceful. There was one race, however, who had mastered the warp in a way that would put even the psychers of the 41st millennium to shame. An ancient, vastly intelligent species whose name is mostly lost to history, but who the Eldari later called the Old Ones. Reptilian in form, or something like it. Impossibly old, impossibly wise. They had built the webway, a network of extra-dimensional tunnels threading through the gap between the warp and real space, allowing them to travel between star systems in seconds. They had seeded worlds with life. They had cultivated young species and nudged them towards sentience. In many ways, the Old Ones were the benevolent architects of the galaxy, patient gardeners tending to the slow growth of civilization across 100,000 worlds. The Old Ones were aware of the Cetan. It's hard to imagine they wouldn't be, given how long they had been watching the galaxy, and how dramatically a Cetan presence affected the electromagnetic environment of any system they inhabited. What the Old Ones felt about the Cetan, whether they feared them, revered them, or simply catalogued their existence the way a naturalist records the behavior of animals, is not fully known. What we do know is that at some point, long before the race that would become the Necrons ever arrived on the cosmic stage, the Old Ones and the Cetan had some kind of conflict. The Deceiver, one of the greatest and most cunning of the Cetan, later claimed to have told the Necrontyr that the Cetan had waged war against the Old Ones and lost, which is why they were hiding. Whether this was true or simply another one of the Deceiver's manipulations is impossible to say with certainty. What we can say is that when the Cetan eventually did gain the ability to interact with the material world directly, the Old Ones became a target. But that comes later. First, there's the matter of a species that discovered something living inside their own sun and decided that was an opportunity rather than a warning. The Cetan, in this ancient period, were not all equal. Some were larger than others, some were older, some had consumed more stellar energy and grown correspondingly more aware, more powerful, more capable of complex thought. There were dozens of them, perhaps more, scattered across the galaxy wherever old dying stars could be found. They had learned over the aeons to travel between stars, to extend what might be called wings made of electromagnetic force, and drift through the space between suns, following the scent of fresh stellar radiation from one dying giant to another. They were, in the most literal possible sense, creatures of the deep cosmos. One of these ancient things had, at some point in the unimaginably distant past, come to rest at a specific star system in the outer regions of the galaxy, far from the lush inner worlds where the Old Ones did their patient gardening. It coiled around a sun that was already old and angry, a star that burned with unusual intensity and emitted lethal levels of ionizing radiation into the surrounding system. And on the closest planet of that system, a species was slowly, painfully, miserably evolving, learning to walk upright, learning to build, learning to die young, cursing a sky that was always trying to kill them. That species was the Necrontyr. And what happened when they finally looked up at their own star and found something looking back at them is the reason we're here today. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is actually a really good time to do that, because we are only getting deeper from here. Section 2, the Necrontyr. A people born to die. Before there were Necrons, cold and silver and deathless, walking through the ruins of a galaxy they once owned, there were the Necrontyr, flesh and blood, breathing and frightened, and burning with all the complicated, beautiful anguish that only mortal creatures seem to manage. They were people. That's the thing that sometimes gets lost when you're looking at the skeleton warriors striding across the battlefield. When you're watching a Necron lord survey the wreckage of an imperial city with those cold green eyes. These were once a people, a civilization, a culture obsessed with death, not because they were cruel, but because death was the unavoidable reality of every single day of their existence. Their home system was brutal. Their star, ancient and unstable, emitted radiation at levels that no organism could comfortably survive for any length of time. The surface of the Necron homeworld was constantly battered by solar winds and ionizing radiation storms that penetrated even the best shielding the early Necron could devise. The planet was, in the most fundamental sense, a prison sentence. Being born there was simply the opening condition of a slow execution. Cancer was not a disease among the Necron so much as it was a background constant. Skin lesions, organ failure, immune collapse, the specific horror of watching your own body destroy itself from the inside while the sky above burned with the wrong kind of light. These were not exceptions to Necron life. They were the texture of it. A Necron might live only a few decades if they were careful, if they stayed underground as much as possible, if they wore what protection they could devise, if they were lucky enough not to be caught in one of the periodic radiation flares that swept across the planet's surface and killed entire communities in hours. The wealthy built their homes deep in the bedrock. The poor lived and died near the surface, which is to say, they mostly just died. Life expectancy was short enough that the entire cultural framework of Necron society had warped around the fact of early death the way a tree grows around a nail. You couldn't build a Necron dynasty, a political system, a religion, an art form, without death being the load-bearing wall of the whole structure. Their cities, those that have been partially reconstructed from Aeldari accounts and the fragmentary records discovered on certain tomb worlds, were extraordinary in a very specific way. The monuments they built were not for the living. The tallest spires, the most ornate carvings, the grandest architectural achievements of Necron civilization were all sepulchres, tombs, mausoleums, funerary complexes that dwarfed the modest homes of the living, crouching in their shadows. On the Necron homeworld, the dead received better accommodations than the living, because the dead at least wouldn't need to move out soon. This is not as grim as it sounds, or at least it's grim in a way that is also somehow poignant. The Necron poured their artistic genius, their engineering skill, their philosophical depth, all the things that a civilization develops when it has time to think and resources to spare, into the construction of monuments to their dead. Because if you're only going to live for a few decades, and your children are only going to live for a few decades, and your greatest ambition cannot extend to seeing any project actually completed in your lifetime, then the only legacy that makes any sense is a physical one. Stone outlasts flesh, metal outlasts bone. If you carve something deep enough into the rock, it will remember you when you are gone. This is where the Necron ruling dynasties came from, and why they were structured the way they were. Because when the average lifespan of your species is measured in decades rather than centuries, inheritance becomes something close to sacred. Your dynasty is the only thing that will carry your name beyond your own brief span. The Triarch, the ruling council of 3 great Pharaon kings who governed the whole fractious empire, understood this perhaps better than anyone, which is why they were so obsessed with finding ways to hold the whole thing together. The Necron Empire was constantly threatening to shatter into warring dynasties, constantly on the edge of civil conflicts that the Triarch called the Wars of Secession. Unity was difficult when nobody could agree on anything long enough to see a project through to completion, and nobody could agree on anything long enough because everyone kept dying before they could finish the argument. When the Necron finally achieved interstellar travel, it was not the triumphant expansion of a confident civilization. It was the desperate flight of a species trying to escape its own sun. Their ships, clad in living metal called necrodermis to resist the punishment of deep space, moved slowly by the standards of the Old One's webway, but moved nonetheless. They built colonies on other worlds. They found some relief from the radiation that had poisoned their home system for so long. They discovered, to their fury and their shame, that there were other species out there who lived long, comfortable lives without the constant threat of their own star trying to murder them. Species who were vigorous and healthy and, in the case of the Old Ones, effectively immortal. The rage that this discovery ignited in the Necron is one of the most important emotional facts in the entire history of Warhammer 40,000. Imagine being born into a situation so terrible that your entire cultural psychology is shaped around accepting early death as inevitable, spending your whole civilization's intellectual energy on monuments to mortality, and then traveling to the stars and finding beings who simply don't die. Not who die slowly or who die well, but who simply have found a way to keep existing, seemingly indefinitely, with full health and vitality, while you and your entire species are burning from the inside on a world that is fundamentally incompatible with continued life. The Necrontyr petitioned the Old Ones for the secret of immortality. By most accounts, the Old Ones refused. The exact reasoning behind this refusal varies across the sources, which are mostly Eldari in origin and therefore not exactly neutral. Some say the Old Ones considered the Necrontyr too immature, too fractious, too emotionally volatile to be trusted with such knowledge. Some say the Old Ones simply didn't want another long-lived species competing with them for galactic resources and influence. Some say the refusal was more complicated than a simple no, that the Old Ones offered other forms of assistance that the Necrontyr, in their fury, rejected as insulting. What is clear is that the refusal created a hatred that would not be quenched for millions of years and would ultimately transform the entire galaxy. The Necrontyr turned their considerable technological gifts toward war. They built weapons. They built fleets. They launched an attack on the Old Ones that was brave, furious, and ultimately hopeless, because the Old Ones had mastery of the webway and could move their forces anywhere in the galaxy in an instant, while the Necrontyr were still constrained by the limitations of their relatively slow ships. The first phase of the conflict, that the Eldari would later call the War in Heaven, ended badly for the Necrontyr. Their fleets were destroyed. Their colonies were threatened. They were pushed back to their home system, to that irradiated prison of a planet, and left to simmer in their defeat. The Triarch, surveying the wreckage of their military ambition, looked for another way forward. The Wars of Secession threatened to tear apart what little remained of Necrontyr unity. They needed something to hold their people together. They needed a weapon that could change the fundamental terms of the conflict. It was in this moment of desperation, this historical inflection point, where a species decides whether it will find a way to survive or simply exhaust itself in pointless revenge, that the Necrontyr researchers turned their attention to the stars. Not to the Old Ones' stars, but to their own, to the ancient dying giant that had been killing them for generations. To the thing their stellar probes had noticed, increasingly, as they studied the complex electromagnetic emissions of their sun. Something in there, something vast and old, and possibly listening. Their researchers had been cataloging unusual electrodynamic anomalies in dying stars for a long time. It was originally a purely practical project, an attempt to understand why their own star was so lethal, whether there was something they could do about the radiation levels, whether they could modify their environment rather than simply endure it. What they found instead was something no scientific framework they possessed could adequately explain. In the plasma of old stars, in the patterns of solar flares and magnetic fields, there was something that answered, not in words, not in any form of communication that a biological mind could initially parse. But there was a response, a feedback loop, a sense that the light and force coming back from these stellar bodies was not entirely random, not entirely mindless. The Necrontyr had found the Cetan, and the Cetan, for the first time in billions of years, noticed something in the material universe that was not a star. What followed is sometimes described as an act of scientific curiosity, and sometimes as an act of terrible recklessness. The Necrontyr researchers, using technology that would have seemed like magic to any species less pragmatically brilliant, constructed physical shells from necrodermis, that living metal they had already been using for their ships. And they invited the things in the stars to cross over, to take form, to come down from the sky and speak with the people who had been dying under them for so long. The first Catan to cross what the records describe as an incorporeal starlight bridge into a physical body was named Azagorod. You might know it by its other name, the Nightbringer. Section 3. The Star Gods Descend. Picture it, if you can. The physical body that the Necrontyr forged for the first Catan was a work of art by any measure. A form made from necrodermis that could expand and contract, that could reshape itself to some degree, that was built to contain something that had previously occupied space, measured in stellar diameters. Thousands of miles of diffuse electromagnetic energy compressed into something that, while still vast by the standards of a biological creature, could at least be looked at and addressed. Translucent streamers of force were seen crossing the gap, ancient accounts tell us. Something vast folding itself down into something smaller. A consciousness that had been spread across solar winds, tightening, focusing, finding the edges of its new cage and testing them, and then accepting them as the necessary price of having hands, of being present in a world made of matter rather than energy, of being able, for the first time, to actually interact with the small, warm, complicated things scurrying around on the surfaces of planets, as Azagorod manifested. And the first thing it did was kill the Necron tier who had summoned it, not out of malice, or not entirely out of malice, more out of the simple shock of discovery. Because what the Nightbringer found when it descended into physicality was something it had never experienced in billions of years of stellar drift, the electromagnetic energy emanating from living biological bodies. The specific, incredibly complex, extraordinarily rich quality of life force, not the raw fusion power of a star, which it had been drinking for aeons, something else. Something that tasted the way a dying sun tastes, compared to the first clean spring water you ever drank. More concentrated, more complex, infinitely more satisfying. The Necrontier researchers who had built the Nightbringer its body and invited it across found themselves providing an inadvertent first meal. The Nightbringer fed on their fear and their pain and their dying, and it found that it liked this new diet far more than solar radiation had ever satisfied it. And as it reached out through the material body it now wore and looked around at the galaxy, for the first time seeing it not as a backdrop of stellar objects, but as a vast landscape teeming with exactly the kind of life force it had just discovered it craved, it understood that an entirely new era of its existence had begun. Only desperate pledges of loyalty and service stopped the Nightbringer from simply consuming every Necron tier it could reach. The survivors of that first terrible contact prostrated themselves before it. They offered it worship, which it found appealing in a way it couldn't quite articulate. They offered it enemies. Specifically, they offered it the Old Ones, and the billions upon billions of living creatures the Old Ones had seeded across the galaxy over millions of years. All of that life, all of that concentrated electromagnetic essence, all of that exquisitely flavored mortality, could be the Nightbringers if it would fight for the Necron tier. The Nightbringer agreed, and the Necron tier began the work of waking more. One by one, other C'tan were drawn across the incorporeal starlight bridge into bodies of necrodermis. Each had to be found first, which meant sending stellar probes into the oldest, most distant dying stars on the edge of the galaxy, locating the electrodynamic signatures that indicated a C'tan presence, and then establishing contact with something whose sense of time was so different from a Necron tier's that the exchange took generations. Each was given form, each was invited to feast, and each, on discovering the extraordinary quality of biological life energy compared to their old stellar diet, accepted the terms the Necron tier were offering. Among these newly embodied gods, one stood apart from the others almost immediately in terms of sheer strategic importance. Not the Nightbringer, who was the most voracious and the most overtly destructive of the early C'tan. Not the vast and terrible entity eventually called the Void Dragon, who was the most technologically sophisticated. The one who changed everything was Mephetran, the Deceiver. The Deceiver was unlike its siblings in a fundamental way. Where other C'tan embodied specific aspects of destruction or power, Mephetran was most comfortable in the spaces between direct action. It was patient in ways that the other C'tan, still drunk on the novelty of having physical form and a new food source, were not. It understood that the most effective way to get what you wanted from smaller creatures was not to simply reach out and take it, though that was certainly available as an option, but to make them want to give it to you, to present the choice as their own, to arrange circumstances so that every path forward led to the same destination. The Deceiver looked at the Necron tier, with their short lives and their desperate hunger for immortality, and their galaxy-spanning rage at the Old Ones, who had denied them that immortality, and it saw an opportunity. The Necron tier were not merely a food source. They were a weapon that could be pointed at the Old Ones and their countless cultivated species, a weapon that would deliver harvests of life energy to the Cetan on an unprecedented scale. But only if they were transformed from the fragile, dying creatures they currently were into something durable enough to wage the kind of war the Cetan required. It was Mephet Ran the Deceiver who brought the proposition to Sarek, the last and greatest of the Silent Kings, the ruler of the entire Necrontyr Triarch. It presented itself in forms the Necrontyr found familiar and reassuring, wearing the shapes of gods from their own mythology. It spoke of a war against the Old Ones that the Cetan had supposedly lost long ago, positioning itself as an ally who needed allies in return. It offered the thing the Necrontyr wanted most desperately in all the universe, not just long life, not just extended years under better conditions, but true immortality, bodies that could not age, bodies that could not be eaten by cancer, bodies that could not be killed by solar radiation or disease, or most forms of violence. Eternal life in forms of indestructible living metal. The Silent King's court was not unanimous in their enthusiasm for this offer. The Necrontyr had advisors. Some of them were wise. One in particular, an astrologer and diviner named Awakens, warned against accepting the Deceiver's offer. His prophecies suggested that the cost would be far higher than what was being disclosed, that what was being offered was not a gift, but a cage, that the Necrontyr would lose something irreplaceable in the process of gaining what they sought. The Silent King listened to the warnings. He weighed them against the desperation of his people, the generations of deaths, the humiliation of their defeat by the Old Ones, the ongoing civil wars threatening to destroy what little unity the Triarch had managed to maintain. And he said, yes. A year after the Deceiver's proposal, the pact was sealed, and the great biofoundries were constructed, and the Necrontyr marched into them. What happened inside those biofoundries to each individual Necrontyr who passed through them is described in fragments that the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Inquisition of the 41st millennium have assembled from pieces of Necron's own records, from Eldari accounts, from the fragmentary testimony of Necron nobles who retained enough of themselves to remember. The process was not painless. It could not have been painless, because it was not simply a transfer of mind into machine. It was a dissolution. The dissolution of everything organic about a living creature, everything that made it vulnerable to the specific agonies of Necrontyr existence, but also everything that made it beautiful. The Cetan, those vast electromagnetic consciousnesses coiling through the air above the biofoundries like dark weather, fed on the substance of the souls released by the process. The life force of an entire species, rising from the furnaces in columns of electromagnetic radiance, consumed. The Necrontyr went in as people. They came out as something else. And above the furnaces, the Cetan glutted themselves for the first time on a feast that made all their previous feasting seem thin and flavorless by comparison. Not individual lives, each exquisite in its own way, but an entire species worth of distilled soul energy, all at once, an all-you-can-eat banquet of mortality that lasted for generations and left the Cetan more powerful than they had ever been. The Deceiver had been right about one thing. The Necrontyr, remade in living metal, would make exceptional soldiers. The Silent King had been wrong about something important. He had not fully understood the price. Section 4. The Devil's Bargain, Biotransference. Sarek, the Silent King, emerged from the biotransference process and looked out at his people. And the word that the sources use, the word that appears in the fragmentary records of Necron nobles who retained enough cognition to remember the moment, is hollowness, an inexpressible hollowness, a gnawing absence where something had been that he could not name, could not point to, could not articulate even in the privacy of his own thoughts. His body was magnificent. He would never deny that. All the aches and uncertainties of organic life were gone. The constant background radiation of his home system, which had been slowly poisoning him since birth, registered now as nothing more than data. His thinking was faster and clearer than it had ever been in flesh. He felt no hunger, no thirst, no pain, no fatigue. His new form was durable beyond anything his engineers had been able to design for the organic Necrontyr. He was, in every measurable physical sense, better than he had been before. But where there had once been something that he thought of as himself, something warm and complex and sometimes contradictory, and occasionally frightened, and always aware of its own eventual ending, there was now an absence. Not darkness, not numbness, something more difficult to describe than either of those, a vast interior silence where the music of a soul had once played. He knew with the cold clarity of a mind now unencumbered by the softening effect of organic emotion, that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of everything that made immortality worth having. He turned and looked at his people. And this is the moment that truly defines the Silent King as a tragic figure rather than simply a villain. Because what he saw was not an army of immortal, empowered Necrontyr ready to take vengeance on the Old Ones. What he saw was the ruin of his civilization. The majority of his people had emerged from the biofoundries as what the sources describe as soulless automatons. Not in any metaphorical sense, literally. The process that had stripped their souls to feed the Satan had also stripped away everything that gave a consciousness its individual character, its capacity for independent thought, its emotional range, its personality. Most of the Necrontyr who had gone into those furnaces, as full, complex, frightened, angry, grieving people, had come out the other side as something closer to machines, with the faint ghost of a person in them, able to follow orders, able to fight, unable to love, or fear, or hope, or dream, or remember what any of those things had felt like. Only a handful of the most strong-willed Necrontyr, the nobles and the generals and the high-ranking members of the military and the ruling dynasties, retained anything recognizable as a full personality, and even they were shadows of what they had been. Dimmer versions. The rich complexity of organic emotion flattened into something more functional and less beautiful. They could think, and they could remember, and they could want things, but the texture of wanting had changed in ways that were difficult to express, except as loss. The biotransference process had also done one other thing that the deceiver had not mentioned, and that Sarek had not anticipated. It had embedded deep within the cognitive architecture of every single Necron a set of command protocols that answered directly to him. The entire species was now, functionally, under his direct command. If he issued an order, every Necron in the galaxy would obey it. There was no option to refuse. The command protocols bypassed individual will entirely. He had absolute control over his people in a way that no Necrontyr monarch had ever possessed, and no Necrontyr monarch would have wanted, because it meant that the creatures he was commanding were not, in any meaningful sense, his people anymore. They were his property, his weapons, his army, and the Satans. The biotransference had also, as a side effect, removed from the Necrontyr any possibility of psychic ability. The warp, that parallel dimension of psychic energy, is fed and shaped by the emotions and consciousnesses of living creatures with souls. The Necrontyr, in their organic form, had some capacity for psychic sensitivity, though it was never developed the way it was in the Eldari. After biotransference, with their souls consumed by the Satan, the Necrons had no connection to the warp whatsoever. They were invisible to it, immune to its effects, unable to use its power. This was, as it turned out, both a significant tactical weakness and a significant tactical advantage, depending on what enemy you were fighting and what conditions prevailed at any given moment. Sarek looked at all of this. He absorbed what had been done, what he had agreed to have done, to an entire civilization. He understood that the warnings he had dismissed had been accurate. He understood that the deceiver had known exactly what biotransference would cost and had chosen not to mention it because the Satan did not operate on a basis of fairness or honest dealing. They operated on hunger and on power, and on the specific satisfaction of making lesser creatures serve them through their own desires and their own desperate choices. And then the command protocols embedded by the biotransference process activated, and Sarek ordered his people to begin fighting the Old Ones, because that was the bargain, and the Satan were watching, and he did not yet have any way to break free of what he had agreed to. He would wait. The war in heaven would play out. The Old Ones would fall. And then, in the moment after victory, when the Satan were distracted and bloated and arrogant, he would begin to plan his revenge. But first, there was the small matter of a galaxy-spanning conflict that would reshape the very nature of the warp and create the conditions for everything that followed, including the Chaos Gods themselves, the Eldari civilization that would one day build the Eye of Terror with its own spiritual collapse, the Orc species, and every other engineered warrior race that the desperate Old Ones would throw against the unstoppable Necron advance. First, there was the War in Heaven. Section 5. The War in Heaven. What the conflict that the Eldari named the War in Heaven actually looked like, day to day, century to century, millennium to millennium, is something the 40,000 setting can only gesture at in fragments and implications. The scale was so enormous, the duration so vast, the participants so cosmically powerful, that even the most comprehensive Eldari records give it a quality more mythological than historical. The numbers involved, the populations destroyed, the star systems made uninhabitable, the species simply erased from existence, all of it exceeds the capacity of conventional historical narrative to convey. So let us instead think about what it meant, rather than what it looked like. The Necron tier, now the Necrons, brought to the conflict something that the Old One's armies had never encountered before. Soldiers who did not die in any final sense. Warriors who, when cut down, would simply begin to reassemble themselves, their living metal bodies knitting back together at the molecular level. The ghost of a Necron tier consciousness reasserting itself into whatever physical form remained, rising again from the battlefield, not because of courage or desperation, but because of the fundamental nature of what the biotransference process had made them. They were not immortal in the sense of being impossible to destroy. Given enough damage, even a Necron warrior would cease to function. But the threshold for that level of damage was vastly higher than anything an organic soldier could absorb, and the capacity to recover from wounds that would be instantly fatal to flesh was almost without limit. Add to this, the Satan themselves, now embodied and fully aware and glutted on the life force of an entire species, blazing with power in their physical forms, able to reach out and extinguish suns, able to tear open black holes with something like casual effort, able to move through matter as though it were not there, and destroy things at a fundamental physical level. And you have a military force that the Old Ones, for all their wisdom and their mastery of the webway and their deep understanding of psychic power, could not simply defeat through conventional means. For a time, it seemed the Old Ones would simply be overwhelmed. The Necrons marched through their carefully cultivated civilizations, the Necron dynasties, spreading outward from world to world in inexorable, patient advance. The Satan fed as they went, harvesting the life force of the Old One's client species, growing still more powerful on the feasting. Stars were extinguished. Whole solar systems were devoured by artificial black holes, called into being by the reality-warping powers of the star gods. The webway, which should have given the Old Ones absolute mobility and therefore absolute strategic advantage, was eventually breached by a specific Satan whose hunger for the contents of that extra-dimensional network outweighed any tactical consideration. The one called Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, showed the Necrons how to force their way into the Old One's private highway through reality. After that, the Old Ones could run, but there was nowhere to run to. The Old One's response was one of the most significant acts of genetic engineering in the history of the galaxy. Understanding that they could not outfight the Necrons with the species they had, they began creating new ones. Warrior races, engineered from scratch or modified from existing species, designed to channel psychic power into combat applications that the soulless Necrons could not replicate or easily counter. The most successful of these projects were, respectively, the ancestors of the Eldari and the ancestors of the Orcs. The Proto-Eldari were psychically gifted in ways that even the Old Ones themselves found remarkable. They developed a deep, intuitive connection to the warp that gave them capabilities far beyond what their physical forms suggested, and they were aesthetically and intellectually sophisticated in ways that would, millions of years later, define them as one of the galaxy's great civilizations. They were created to be weapons, but they became something far more interesting than that. The Proto-Orcs, by contrast, were exactly what they were designed to be. Massive, fungal, biologically robust creatures whose physiology essentially ignored the concept of fear, whose very presence generated a kind of ambient psychic field that made them more effective in combat simply by the fact of being together. They were bred for war and violence in the most literal possible sense. They were, in the language of the Old One's lab notes, the perfect grunt. These new species fighting alongside the Old Ones began to turn the tide. The psychic powers they wielded were a genuine counter to the C'tan's electromagnetic nature. The warp, which had been essentially irrelevant to the C'tans' concerns for their entire existence, suddenly became a battlefield on which the C'tan were genuinely vulnerable. They hated it. The warp was anathema to beings whose existence was entirely contained within physical patterns of electromagnetic force. Where the Old One's psychic warrior species could draw power from the Imperium and throw it against the C'tan directly, the star gods found themselves unable to respond in kind, and unable to simply endure the psychic attacks the way they could endure most forms of physical assault. The war began to swing back. Not quickly, not cleanly, not in any simple sense. But the momentum that had seemed so unstoppably on the Necron side began to slow. And then the C'tan did something that ultimately contributed as much to their own defeat as anything the Old Ones engineered against them. They began eating each other. The C'tan, remember, had been somewhat isolated from each other for most of their ancient existence, each drifting alone around dying stars in remote parts of the galaxy. Their understanding of cooperation was limited. Their respect for the autonomy of their fellow star gods was negligible once they discovered that consuming another C'tan was even more satisfying than consuming a species' worth of biological life force. One C'tan contained within its electromagnetic body the accumulated energy of billions of years of stellar feeding. Consuming one's siblings was, from a strictly energetic perspective, the most efficient possible use of available resources. The Aeldari laughing god, Segorak, the trickster deity of that psychically gifted young species, allegedly had a role in encouraging this internal conflict among the C'tan. The specific mechanism by which a newly created psychic god managed to manipulate beings of such ancient and immense power is lost to the kind of mythological fog that tends to obscure events that occurred 60 million years before the fog era we're concerned with. What is clear from every account is that the C'tan turned on each other, and in the course of their fratricidal war, whole planets were razed, stars were consumed, and whatever remaining goodwill might have existed between the various star gods was comprehensively destroyed. One C'tan in particular developed a hunger for its siblings so intense that it consumed dozens, perhaps hundreds of them. It devoured the smaller, weaker entities first, then turned on those of more equivalent power, growing with each consumption into something more vast and more terrible than any individual C'tan had ever been. But alongside the power came the voices of every entity it had consumed, rattling around inside a consciousness that was not designed to hold multiple identities, multiple sets of ancient memories, multiple incompatible personalities, all screaming at each other across the electromagnetic equivalent of an interior landscape. This C'tan broke under the weight of what it had consumed. It lost cohesion in a psychological sense, even as it gained power in a physical one. It became mad. Deeply, cosmically, irreversibly mad. You'll hear more about this one later. The Necrons call it Tsaranoga. The galaxy knows it, to the extent it knows it at all, as the outsider. The Old Ones and their psychic warrior species pressed their advantage during the C'tan's internal conflict. But even a weakened C'tan is something that defies ordinary weapons. The war ground on. And perhaps the most terrible consequence of the war in heaven was not the deaths it caused, the species it destroyed, or even the political map of the galaxy it shattered. The most terrible consequence was what it did to the warp. The psychic upheaval of the conflict, the vast outpouring of emotion and fear and pain and death from billions of creatures across tens of millions of years, soaked into the Imperium and began to change it. The warp had been calm before the Old Ones began engineering their psychically gifted warrior species. It became less calm as those species fought and suffered and died in their millions. The currents within it began to shift. Eddies of specific emotion formed around concentrations of psychic activity. Things began to stir in the depths of the Imperium that had not been there before. Nascent forms, made of nothing but the psychic residue of the war in heaven, taking shape in the deep places of the warp. The Chaos Gods did not exist before the war in heaven. They were born from it. The violence and the chaos and the ambition and the corruption of war, flowing into the warp as psychic energy from billions of suffering, dying creatures, slowly condensing around the pre-existing currents of the Imperium into personalities, into hungers, into gods of a very different sort from the C'tan. These would not emerge fully into the forms we know until much later, but the seeds were planted in the war, in heaven's fertile fields of pain. Eventually, the old ones were beaten. However, it precisely happened, whether through the final military exhaustion of their species, or the breakdown of their civilization under constant Necron pressure, or simply the accumulated weight of millions of years of total war, the old ones either died or fled the galaxy. They left behind their created species to survive as best they could. The Aldari flourished, inheriting the webway and the genetic gifts their creators had built into them, and becoming for a time one of the greatest civilizations the galaxy had ever seen. The proto-orcs spread across countless worlds, following the biological imperative their creators had programmed into them, fighting whatever was available to fight. The Necrons stood over a shattered galaxy and looked at what they had won, and Sarek, the silent king, who had been waiting with the patient cold fury of a being who has spent millions of years holding his anger in reserve, decided that the time had come. Section 6. The Great Betrayal, Shattering the Gods. The C'tan, bloated on war and victory, did not see it coming. This was perhaps their greatest failure of imagination, and it speaks to a fundamental limitation in the kind of intelligence they possessed. The C'tan understood physics. They understood the nature of stars, and the quality of life energies, and the tactics of direct military confrontation. What they did not understand, had never needed to understand in billions of years of solitary stellar feeding, was betrayal by inferiors. The concept that the beings they had remade as tools might have retained the capacity for strategic deception across millions of years of enforced service did not apparently register as a serious consideration. Sarek had been waiting since the moment he stepped out of the biofoundry and felt the hollowness where his soul had been. Every order he had issued to his people in the millennia since had been an order toward one eventual destination, even when none of his subjects could have seen the destination in the individual orders, even when Sarek himself had not been sure the moment would come. But the old ones were finished, or close enough to finished that their remaining influence was not a factor in what came next. The young species they had created were not yet powerful enough to threaten the Necrons. The C'tan were distracted and arrogant and consumed with their internal conflicts. The window was as open as it was ever going to be. The Necrons turned on their gods. The weapons they used were extraordinary. Technologies refined over millions of years of war. Technologies that had been developed specifically to harm things operating at physical scales that conventional weapons couldn't touch. Technologies built to focus the fundamental energies of the material universe into something that could crack a being made of electromagnetic force. The C'tan, who had considered themselves invulnerable in any practical sense that mattered, discovered in these last terrible moments that their Necron servants had been better students than they imagined. The Necrons had spent the war in heaven learning what the C'tan were made of, learning how they worked, and quietly, carefully, without ever making it visible, learning how to destroy them. They could not fully destroy them. The C'tan's power exceeded even the Necrons' considerable ability to completely annihilate. Total destruction was not achievable, which is a fact that will become very important when we discuss what's happening in the 41st millennium. What the Necrons could do, and what they did with ruthless efficiency, was shatter. They used their focused weapons to fracture each C'tan into multiple pieces, not into dust, not into nothing. Into fragments, each containing a portion of the original entity's power and something of its consciousness, each still dangerous and aware and furious, but diminished, manageable, small enough to be contained. The devices they used to contain the shards were called tesseract labyrinths. These are extra-dimensional pocket spaces, arcane and incredibly sophisticated pieces of technology, even by Necron standards, that create a kind of internal reality in which a C'tan shard can exist, but from which it cannot escape under normal circumstances. The shards are not unconscious inside their prisons. They are aware. They remember what they were before the shattering. They feel the loss of their former power, the loss of the other parts of themselves that the shattering dispersed, the indignity of being contained by the species they created and enslaved. They rage. They scheme. They wait. Some C'tan were not captured. One was destroyed completely, though at terrible cost. The C'tan called Landugor the Flayer refused to simply be shattered, and the Necrons had to obliterate it utterly, which they managed, but which came with a price. In its final moments of existence, the Flayer cursed the Necrons with an echo of its own monstrous hunger. This curse manifested in what became known as the Flayer virus, a psychological corruption that afflicts some Necrons, causing them to become obsessed with biological flesh in a desperate, irrational attempt to feel mortal again. The Flayed Ones, those disturbing Necron warriors who drape themselves in the skins and entrails of their victims, are the living legacy of this dying curse. One Citan escaped containment entirely, though not through any form of resistance. The one called Saranoga, the Outsider, was already so deep in its self-inflicted madness from consuming its siblings that the Necrons either could not reach it or decided that the risks of attempting to shatter something so unstable and powerful outweighed the benefits of controlling it. The Outsider, carrying within its fractured consciousness the voices of every entity it had devoured, fled the known galaxy entirely. We will return to it later, because its potential return is one of the most alarming, unresolved threads in all of 40,000 lore. The rest were captured, shattered, and contained. Imprisoned in Tesseract labyrinths and filed away like terrible weapons that you hope you never need to use, but want to have available just in case. From masters, the Citan had become tools. From gods, they had become batteries. From the entities who had given the Necrons immortality, and then taken everything that made immortality meaningful, they had become prisoners of the species they had enslaved. In terms of narrative satisfaction, it was a magnificent reversal. In terms of actual lasting harm done, it was too late to undo most of the damage. The Necrons had their revenge. They had broken their gods. But the price that had been paid was already paid, already permanent. The soul harvest of biotransference could not be reversed. The Necrontyr were gone, replaced by the hollowed-out metal facsimiles of themselves. The war in heaven had shattered the galaxy's psychic equilibrium and planted the seeds of the chaos gods in the warp. The old ones were gone, their patient civilization of millions of years destroyed. The young species they had created were on their own, inheriting a galaxy that was already scarred and warped and more dangerous than it had any right to be. Sarek surveyed all of this. He looked at his people, those metal millions who could function perfectly well without souls, but who were not, in any sense that he could recognize, really his people anymore. He looked at the galaxy, blossoming now with psychic life in the form of the Eldari and their kin, creatures connected to the warp in ways the soulless Necrons could never match. He understood that the Necrons, exhausted by aeons of war, could not hold what they had taken, not against the nascent psychic power of the Eldari, not against the warp corruption now spreading through the galaxy like a slow-moving fire. So he gave his last command. The Necrons would sleep. He issued the order to all the Necron dynasties. Transform your worlds into tomb complexes. Seal yourselves in stasis crypts and wait for 60 million years. Wait until the Eldari civilization has risen and fallen. Wait until the younger races have exhausted themselves with their wars and their ambitions. Wait until the galaxy is ripe for a different kind of Necron conquest. Then wake, and reclaim what was ours. It was a good plan, as far as these things go. Sarek destroyed the command protocols that had allowed him to control his people directly, because what he had done to them was unforgivable, and he knew it. He severed the last chain, binding him to his throne, and took ship into the intergalactic void, there to find whatever penance was available to the being who had damned an entire species for the sake of a war that was, in the end, just another war. He was the only Necron who had retained enough of himself to fully remember what had been lost. He carried that memory alone into the darkness between galaxies. And in the sealed tomb worlds, the dead who were not dead settled into their stasis crypts, and the lights went out, and the long quiet began. 60 million years. Section 7. The Citan, as weapons and prisoners. In the 41st millennium, when the Necrons are beginning to wake, and the galaxy is discovering what it means to have an enemy that was ancient before its own sun had cooled, the Citan shards are both the Necrons' most terrifying weapon and their most carefully guarded secret. To understand what the Necrons are actually trying to wake up, and why some of them are doing so, and why others are desperately trying to prevent any such thing, you need to understand what a Citan shard actually is, how it differs from the original, and what the different shards represent in terms of threat level and implied agenda. A A Cetan shard is, at its most basic level, a fragment of an original Cetan's electromagnetic consciousness and power. When Sarek and his Necrons turned their focused weapons on the star gods and shattered them, each Cetan broke into multiple pieces. The exact number of shards that resulted from each shattering varies, and the lore is appropriately vague about precise numbers. What is consistent across all the sources is that each shard retains a portion of the original's power, a portion of its memories, and most importantly, a portion of its personality. It knows what it is. It knows what it was. It knows what was done to it. And it is not happy about any of these things. The Necrons control the shards through the Tesseract labyrinths and, for the most powerful ones, through devices called Tesseract vaults, which are essentially mobile prisons that can be deployed in battle and open just enough to let the shard do damage, before the Canoptech sentinels that manage it slam the doors shut again. Even a shard of a shattered Catan, diminished and divided and enraged, is capable of effects that would make a Space Marine's blood run cold. They can manifest blasts of pure energy powerful enough to reduce armored vehicles to slag. They can reshape the local laws of physics with a gesture, bending space and time around themselves in ways that make conventional battlefield logic completely irrelevant. They can tear open small fissures in reality, phase-shift matter into different states, manipulate electromagnetism in ways that fry electronics from kilometers away. Think about that for a moment. A shard is a fraction, possibly a small fraction, of an original Cetan, and a single shard can do all of that. Now consider what happens if those shards were to be recombined into something approaching the original entity's coherence and power. This is the fear that runs beneath everything to do with the Cetan in the current era. Not the shards themselves, frightening as they are, but the possibility that circumstances could arise under which the shards of a given Cetan were brought together and allowed to reconstitute something closer to the original. This has not happened yet, as far as the lore has established, but the possibility is never far from the surface of the conversation. Let's talk about the specific Cetan shards and what they represent, because each one is a different kind of threat and a different kind of horror. Asa Gorod the Nightbringer is arguably the most symbolically resonant of the Cetan shards in the current era. In its ancient form, before the shattering, the Nightbringer had something that none of the other Cetan can claim. It reached into the collective unconscious of virtually every species in the galaxy and left a permanent mark. During the War in Heaven, the Nightbringer went beyond simply killing things. It nurtured entire species to fear it, imprinting its own image onto the deep psychic architecture of their consciousness. The Nightbringer's preferred form was something you might recognize, a tall skeletal figure robed in darkness, carrying a scythe. Sound familiar? It should. Every culture that developed on every world in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, with one notable exception, independently arrived at the concept of death as a tall skeleton carrying a blade. Humans call it the Grim Reaper. The Eldari call it Kalis Ra, the Destroyer of Light. Virtually every other species that developed the concept of death as a distinct entity or force in the universe did so by describing something that looks remarkably like the Nightbringer, because the Nightbringer spent the War in Heaven killing things in vast quantities and deliberately burning its own image into the collective psychic residue of every sentient species it could reach. It wanted to be feared. It wanted the concept of death itself to carry its face. The one exception is the orcs. The orcs do not have a Grim Reaper mythology. They have no particular fear of death. And this is, according to the lore, directly because the orcs were created after the Nightbringer had done its worst. The Krork, the ancestors of the orcs, were engineered by the Old Ones toward the end of the War in Heaven. By that point, the Nightbringer had already imprinted its image on every other species it could reach. The Krork were simply too new to have been exposed to it. And so, the orcs, uniquely among the galaxy's major species, genuinely do not fear death in the way everyone else does. Not because they're brave, because a god didn't spend millions of years teaching them to be terrified. The Nightbringer shards are the most reliably destructive of the Cetan weapons the Necrons currently deploy. They manifest as close-range engines of slaughter, feeding on the fear and the death around them, resonating with the concept of mortality in ways that make them uniquely effective against organic opponents. Veteran Space Marine chapters have standing protocols for encountering a Nightbringer shard in the field, and those protocols are mostly variations on don't be in front of it. Mephitran, the deceiver, operates very differently. Where the Nightbringer is a hammer, the deceiver is a scalpel. A scalpel made of lies, wielded by something that has no interest in being honest with you about what it's cutting and why. The deceiver was always the most strategically sophisticated of the Catan, and its shards retain this quality. In the current era, deceiver shards have been active for longer than most other Catan shards, and they have been busy. There are accounts across the 41st millennium of a being matching the deceiver's description, manipulating events from behind layers of disguise and misdirection. In earlier editions of the lore, the deceiver was instrumental in destroying the talismans of Vol, ancient weapons created by the Old Ones for use against the Catan, which the Eldari had carefully preserved. The deceiver arranged for these to be destroyed before the Eldari could use them, which tells you something about the deceiver's patience and long-term planning. The question of what the deceiver actually wants, beyond the obvious desire for freedom from its Tesseract prison and access to the life energies of living things, is one that lore scholars genuinely debate. Its behavior in the current era suggests agendas that are not fully visible, layers of manipulation that may be working toward goals that won't be apparent until they're already achieved. This is appropriate for a being whose entire identity is wrapped up in the art of making others dance to music they can't hear. Then there is Magladroth, the Void Dragon. And the Void Dragon requires its own section, because the Void Dragon is sleeping beneath Mars, and the implications of that fact are staggering. Section 8, the Dragon Beneath Mars. There is a location on Mars called the Noctis Labyrinthus, which translates as the Labyrinth of Night. In the real world, it is a geological formation between the Valles Marineris and the Tharsis uplands, a complex of steep-walled canyons that forms what would look from orbit like a natural maze cut into the surface of the red planet. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, it is this and something else entirely. It is also one of the most carefully guarded secrets in the Imperium of Man. Deep beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, held in a stasis prison of Necron design, modified and maintained by individuals chosen by the Emperor of Mankind himself, sleeps something that the Adeptus Mechanicus has chosen to worship as a god. Let us establish what we know about Magladroth, the Void Dragon, because the Void Dragon is arguably the most significant Catan when it comes to the question of what the Necrons might be trying to wake up and why. Among all the Catan, the Void Dragon was distinguished by a specific quality that separated it from its siblings, where the Nightbringer embodied destruction and the Deceiver embodied manipulation, and most of the others embodied various flavors of consuming power. The Void Dragon had something closer to what you might call a technical intellect. It was the most sophisticated of the Catan in terms of understanding the material universe at the level of fundamental physics. It grasped the principles underlying Necron technology with an intuitive clarity that made even the Cryptex, those master scientists of the Necron dynasties, seem like apprentices in comparison. The Void Dragon could, reportedly, interact with technology in ways that seemed almost magical. It could understand and manipulate complex mechanical systems simply by existing in proximity to them. It was, in the language of the 40,000 setting, the Catan most associated with the raw power of material science. This is directly relevant to the Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of Mars, and the entire theology of the machine god, which is what the Mechanicus calls the divine entity they believe underlies all technology, and to whom their entire religious and scientific framework is oriented. The machine god, or Omnissiah, is the supreme focus of Mechanicus worship. The tech priests believe that all machines have spirits, that technology is sacred, that the highest aspiration of human existence is to understand and commune with the mysteries of the machine. Their rituals of maintenance are prayers. Their technological research is spiritual devotion. Their entire civilization is built around the worship of this divine principle of the machine. Except, it may not be a principle at all. It may be a very old, very powerful electromagnetic consciousness sleeping under a series of canyon systems on a red planet. The theory, which is supported by evidence from multiple sources across the 40,000 lore, but has never been definitively confirmed, is that the entity sleeping beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus is Magladroth, the Void Dragon, and that the Adeptus Mechanicus, who were the most powerful and influential technological civilization in the Imperium of Man, who control the production of every significant military technology the Imperium possesses, who are effectively partners to the Imperium rather than subjects of it, have been unknowingly worshipping a imprisoned Khitan. The evidence for this is extensive. The Dragon of Mars, as it is known to the handful of initiates who are aware of its existence, is described in the fragmentary records available as a being that once lived in space between the stars, as a being whose scales are silver and liquid, matching the description of Necrodermis, as an entity that has, even in its imprisoned state, been influencing the minds of the humans living on Mars for millennia, inspiring a particular affinity for mechanical systems that manifests as the tech priest's ability to understand and commune with technology in ways that seem to exceed purely rational explanation. It was the Horus Heresy novel Mechanicum by Graham McNeill that gave this theory its most explicit treatment in the fiction. In that novel, set in the very beginnings of the Schism of Mars, when the Mechanicum tore itself apart over loyalty to Horus or loyalty to the Emperor, a young woman named Dahlia Cythera encounters the Dragon of Mars directly. She is subsequently transformed into something more than human, a perpetual, granted an unnaturally extended lifespan by the will of the Emperor to serve as a guardian of the dragon. And what the novel reveals about the dragon, about its influence on Martian technological development, about the Emperor's knowledge of its presence, is deeply unsettling. The Emperor knew the dragon was there. The Emperor, in some account of events that occurred before the Age of Strife, fought the dragon. The struggle between these two immensely powerful entities, whatever its precise nature, ended with the dragon imprisoned beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus. The Emperor then, according to the account preserved by the guardian adept Semyon, deliberately cultivated the Adeptus Mechanicus on Mars, using the dragon's passive influence as a kind of technological inspiration battery, allowing the sleeping entity to leak just enough of its affinity for mechanical systems into the collective consciousness of Mars to inspire extraordinary technological development, while keeping it contained enough not to pose an immediate threat. If this is true, and the sources suggest very strongly that it is true, then the entire technological foundation of the Imperium of Man has been built on the dream state emissions of a sleeping god. Every Astartes bolter, every Titan war machine, every void ship, every lasgun that has ever fired on a battlefield of the Imperium was, in some sense, inspired by the unconscious emanations of a Khitan lying in a cage beneath Mars. In 998 of the 41st millennium, 5 Necron Shroud-class light cruisers executed what the Imperial Navy logged as a suicide run at Mars. They breached planetary defenses at the cost of their own hulls and made landfall near the Noctis Labyrinthus before being destroyed. What exactly they were attempting to do in the Noctis Labyrinthus is not established in the sources. It might have been an attempt to communicate with the imprisoned dragon. It might have been an attempt to assess the dragon's status, to check on the condition of one of their most powerful former masters. It might have been something else entirely. What it definitely was a sign that the Necrons know the dragon is there, that they know exactly where on Mars it is being held, and that they have, at least once, been willing to sacrifice significant military assets to approach it. The Void Dragon, if it were to be freed from its imprisonment, would not simply be another Khitan shard deplorable as a weapon on a battlefield. The Void Dragon, in anything approaching its original form, would be the single most powerful technological intelligence in the galaxy. An entity with total intuitive mastery of all material technology, freed from its cage, potentially capable of unlocking capabilities in Necron technology that haven't been seen since the War in Heaven. An entity that has been feeding, however passively, on the devotion of millions of Mechanicus tech priests for thousands of years. An entity that the Emperor of Mankind himself considered dangerous enough to fight personally, and then spend the rest of his existence keeping contained. If it woke up, the galaxy would not know what to do about it. The Imperium certainly wouldn't. The Mechanicus might think it was a miracle before they understood what was happening. And by the time they understood what was happening, it would be much too late. Section 9. The Great Awakening and the Pylon Network. It began, as these things often do in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, by accident. The Necron Great Sleep was supposed to be precise, 60 million years, give or take, with the Necrons' internal chronostats adjusting for any drift in their stasis systems, and then a coordinated awakening of tomb worlds across the galaxy, in a sequence calibrated to give the revived Necron dynasties the best possible strategic position for beginning their reconquest. This was the plan. This is what the Silent King's final order prescribed before he took ship into the intergalactic void. The plan encountered reality. 60 million years is a very long time, even for a species with access to perfect stasis technology. Stars shift. Planetary orbits change. Tectonic activity destroys structures built with materials never designed to resist the slow grinding of continental drift over geological timescales. Cosmic events, supernovae, and gravitational interactions and simple entropy do things to sealed tomb worlds that no blueprint can fully anticipate. And the creatures the Old Ones had seeded across the galaxy, those organic species who had been slowly developing their civilizations on worlds that were unknown to them, Necron property from 60 million years ago, turned out to be surprisingly good at disturbing sealed vaults when they thought there might be something valuable inside. The result was that the Great Awakening was not the coordinated, simultaneous rising that Sarek had envisioned. It was messy. Some tomb worlds woke early, their chronostats disrupted, their inhabitants finding themselves standing in the ruins of structures that had experienced far more wear than the 60 million years of stasis they had been promised. Some tomb worlds woke on schedule, but found their situation dramatically more complicated than expected. Some tomb worlds haven't woken yet. Even now, in the late 41st millennium, billions of Necrons lie sealed in stasis beneath worlds that other species have colonized, built on, fought over, and claimed as their own, without the slightest awareness that they are living on someone else's property. The ones that have woken are discovering a galaxy full of life in ways that 60 million years of stasis could not have prepared them for. The Necron tier, before the war in heaven, had built their civilization in a galaxy where the Old Ones were the dominant power, and young species were still being cultivated into significance. The Necrons went to sleep in a galaxy where the Eldari were ascendant, and everything else was still finding its feet. What they woke to find was the 41st millennium, a galaxy teeming with life in dozens of species, dominated by the aggressively expanding Imperium of man, threatened by the Tyranid invasion, torn open by the Great Rift. Not the quiet, winding-down galaxy they had expected, where they would rise unopposed into a power vacuum. For many Necron lords and pharaons waking from 60 million years of dreamless metal sleep, the first sensation is disorientation, so profound, it reads almost as a kind of grief. Not grief for themselves, exactly. They are past most organic forms of grief, but a cold, metallic recognition of loss. The galaxy they remembered, the one they had dominated and then carefully folded themselves away from to wait out, is gone. The landmarks they knew are gone. The configurations of the stars have shifted. The species that surrounded them in their last conscious memories are either extinct, transformed beyond recognition, or replaced by entirely new actors they have no intelligence on. The Silent King, Sarek himself, returned to the galaxy in the 744th year of the 41st millennium, ending his self-imposed exile in the intergalactic void. He returned not because 60 million years had somehow resolved his guilt, or because he had found a way to reverse biotransference. He returned because he had seen something out there in the dark between galaxies that changed his calculations about what the Necrons' immediate priorities should be. He had seen the Tyranids, the leading tendrils of the great hive fleets, those biological horror masses consuming everything in their path as they crossed the gulf between galaxies. He had understood immediately what they were and what they meant. If the Tyranids consumed all organic life in the galaxy, there would be nothing left to serve as templates for reversing biotransference. The Necrons' dim hope of someday reclaiming living flesh, that haunting, almost impossible dream that some of the more self-aware Necron lords carried like a splinter of the past, would be extinguished permanently. Not just deferred, gone. The Tyranids were therefore an existential threat to the Necrons' future, in a way that transcended military competition for territory. So Sarek came back, and he began doing what Sarek does, playing a very long game, whose moves are only visible in retrospect. The most visible expression of this game in the current era is the thing called the Pariah Nexus, and the broader project of what the Codex materials describe as the Contra-Empiric Network. The Necrons, it turns out, have a plan for the warp. They have had a plan for the warp since the War in Heaven, when the Satan first conceived of it and had their Necron slaves begin constructing the infrastructure to implement it. That infrastructure is the pylon network, the Cadian pylons, those massive standing stones of Blackstone that the Adeptus Mechanicus spent millennia studying without quite understanding, were part of this network. Their purpose was always to dampen the overlap between the warp and real space in their vicinity, to create regions of space insulated from the Imperium's influence. The Cadian Gate, that relatively stable corridor through the otherwise warp-turbulent region around the Eye of Terror, existed precisely because those pylons had been functioning for millions of years, quietly doing what they were designed to do. Abaddon the Despoiler understood this. His 13th Black Crusade and the ultimate destruction of Cadia was, among other things, a targeted strike against the pylon network. By crashing the corrupted Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity into Cadia's surface and destroying both the planet and its pylons, Abaddon removed one of the key nodes of the Necron network, and the Eye of Terror expanded catastrophically in response, combining with other warp anomalies to form the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, that now splits the galaxy in half. The Necrons were not pleased about this. It disrupted their plans significantly, but they adapted. The Silent King, working through layers of secrecy so thick that even most Necron leaders don't know the full shape of his agenda, has been directing the reconstruction and expansion of the pylon network across multiple sectors of space. The Pariah Nexus, the largest known active pylon network in the current era, covers a significant stretch of space and has had measurable effects on the warp, creating a region where psychic activity is suppressed, where life itself seems to lose some of its vitality, where even the most robust human colonists within its boundaries report a creeping, sourceless despair. The full goal of this project, revealed gradually across recent editions and narrative materials, is staggering in its ambition and its horror. The Necrons don't want to destroy the warp entirely. Surex analysts have apparently concluded that a total severing of the material universe from the Imperium would likely kill most forms of life in the galaxy, since psychic beings and creatures with souls depend on the warp's existence in ways that are fundamental. This would leave the Necrons ruling a galaxy of corpses, which is not actually what they want. What the Silent King wants, according to the most current reading of the Codex materials, is something more precise. He wants to dial the warp's influence down to the point where all the psychic species in the galaxy are reduced to something close to mindless docility. Not dead, manageable, unable to resist, unable to threaten. Available as biological material for the experiments the Necrons' cryptechs are conducting into potential methods of reversing biotransference. The Silent King wants to recover his people's souls. He wants to undo the greatest crime in the history of the galaxy. And his current plan for achieving this involves turning the living inhabitants of the galaxy into compliant biological material for medical experimentation, until he finds the answer. There is something both tragic and monstrous about this, which is exactly the kind of moral ambiguity that makes the Necrons one of the most fascinating factions in the setting. But underneath all of this, underneath the grand strategy of the Pylon Network and the Pariah Nexus and the Silent King's desperate quest for biological redemption, there are the shards, still imprisoned, still conscious, still furious. And in certain places across the galaxy, certain Necron factions are doing things with those shards that Sarek may or may not have sanctioned. There are overlords who see the imprisoned Cetan not as weapons to be carefully deployed in moments of extreme military necessity, but as resources to be cultivated. There are cryptechs who have been conducting experiments on the boundary between a Cetan shard's imprisonment and its freedom, probing the edges of the Tesseract technology, trying to understand whether it might be possible to draw more power from a shard without releasing it. And there are, the most disturbing accounts suggest, factions who believe that releasing a Cetan, or even reassembling one from its scattered shards, might serve certain Necron interests in ways that the Silent King's careful management would never permit. Necrosor Amintar, a destroyer cultist commander, has reportedly been assembling shards of the Nightbringer deliberately, collecting them across multiple systems, seeking to restore something approaching the original entity. His stated motivation is that a fully restored Nightbringer would be an unstoppable weapon. Whether this is genuinely his only motivation, or whether something in the Nightbringer's own influence is guiding his actions, is a question the Necrons who are aware of his project have been slow to investigate. The shards of the Nightbringer, it is noted, have a degree of control over Amantar that suggests the power dynamic in this relationship is not entirely in the direction he thinks it is. Section 10. What it all means, the greatest sleeping horror. Let's bring it all together, because the question we started with, what are the Necrons actually trying to wake up, turns out to have multiple answers operating simultaneously on different levels, and none of them are reassuring. On the most immediate, visible level, the Necrons are trying to wake themselves up. This is the obvious answer, and it's true as far as it goes. The Great Awakening is happening now, in the 41st millennium, and it represents the attempted revival of a civilization that was galaxy-spanning and technologically supreme 60 million years ago. Even at a fraction of their original strength, even with the damage that 60 million years of stasis has done to many tomb worlds and their populations, the awakening Necron dynasties represent a threat that the Imperium and every other faction is scrambling to assess and respond to. On a second level, the Necrons are trying to wake up the possibility of their own redemption. Sarek's entire current agenda, the pylon network, the silent political maneuvering, the careful cultivation of specific alliances with Tyranid-fighting factions like the Space Marines in certain circumstances, all of it is in service of the distant, possibly impossible goal of reversing biotransference, of waking up the Necrontyr who are buried somewhere deep inside the metal shells of the Necrons, of recovering the souls that were devoured 60 million years ago in furnaces above which the Satan danced with something like joy. On a third level, whether they intend to or not, the Necrons are trying to wake up the Catan. Every tomb world that activates, every tesseract labyrinth that is unsealed to release a shard for battlefield use, every cryptech experiment on the boundaries of Cetan containment brings the shards closer to some kind of expanded activity. The shards are aware. They are planning, to whatever extent, a fragmented consciousness, trapped in an extra-dimensional prison, can plan. Some of them have already achieved a degree of influence over the Necrons, tasked with managing them, that suggests the balance of power inside those containment devices is not as stable as the Necrons prefer to believe. And on the deepest, most terrifying level, what the accumulated weight of all these activities may be working toward, whether anyone intends it or not, is the possible restoration of something that was supposed to be gone forever. The Cetan, whole and unshattered. Consider what a restored Cetan would mean. Not a shard, not a fragment, not a diminished piece of something greater, but the actual original entity, reconstituted from its scattered pieces, back to the power and consciousness it possessed before the Necron revolt. A being that last operated at full strength 60 million years ago, and is, even in its current shattered state, deploying as one of the most powerful entities in the setting, scaled back up, freed from the Tesseract cage, with 60 million years of accumulated rage directed at the species that imprisoned it. The Nightbringer, fully restored, would be the embodiment of death in a very literal sense, not a metaphor, not a symbol, something that had already reached into the collective unconscious of every species in the galaxy except the Orcs, and written its own image as the face of mortality. Something that had already demonstrated the capacity to kill on a scale that made wars look like individual murders. Fully reconstituted, with all the power that the shattering dispersed now recombined and focused, it would be a military asset that rendered every other military consideration in the galaxy irrelevant, not a weapon. A force of nature. The Void Dragon, freed from beneath Mars, would be something different, but in some ways more concerning. A Satan, with total mastery over material technology, freed from a cage that the Emperor himself put it in, immediately adjacent to the most important forge world in the galaxy, surrounded by millions of tech priests who have been worshipping it as a god for thousands of years without knowing it. The Mechanicus would not resist the Void Dragon. They might not even want to. Some of them might experience its emergence as the fulfillment of their deepest religious expectations. The sight of the machine god manifesting in physical form, walking out of the Noctis Labyrinthus, might be the most theologically significant event in Mechanicus history, and then it would eat them. And then there is the outsider. The outsider, Tsaranoga, is the most unsettling element of all the C'tan lore precisely because it sits outside the main story in a way that defies comfortable resolution. It is, by all indications, the last fully intact C'tan, not shattered, not imprisoned, except by its own madness and self-imposed exile beyond the edge of the galaxy. It contains within its fractured consciousness the remnants of dozens of its siblings, the entities it consumed during the war in heaven, their voices still screaming inside it, across the millions of years of its exile, driving it further and further from anything resembling stable consciousness. The outsider currently exists within a hollow planetoid, somewhere south of the galaxy's plane, drifting in the intergalactic void. Those who have come close to it, or close to the region of space where it dwells, report that its presence induces madness. Not metaphorical madness, literal cognitive breakdown. People finding reasons to kill themselves, rather than continue to be in proximity to whatever the outsider's existence radiates into the space around it. A farseer of Ulthwé described, in a vision, seeing the outsider's writhing, inverted geometries curling around a harvest of creatures that clambered and crawled through its illogical labyrinth, their sanity long since consumed, chasing a hope of escape that the outsider keeps alive specifically to extend their suffering. There is a prophecy, recorded in multiple places across the 40,000 lore in various forms, that speaks of 4 great C'tan returning to the galaxy: the Master of Death, the Jackal God, the Dragon, and that which lies outside, the Nightbringer, the Deceiver, the Void Dragon, the Outsider. 4 beings, 3 currently imprisoned in various ways, and 1 exiled by its own madness, all potentially returning to the galaxy in full force. The prophecy describes this as an age in which the dead shall rise and the galaxy shall run red, which, in the context of the Necron awakening, sounds less like a metaphor and more like a literal description of the current strategic situation. There is also the question of what the Deceiver is actually doing. Of all the C'tan shards, Mephitrans have been active longest and have operated with the most apparent strategic coherence. The Deceiver came out of stasis early, before most other C'tan shards were deployed, and it has been weaving its plots across the galaxy for an unknown but presumably very long time. The destruction of the Talismans of Vol, those ancient anti-C'tan weapons the Aeldari had carefully preserved, is widely attributed to the Deceiver's machinations. What else it has arranged, what long-term projects it has been managing across the centuries, is not fully known by any faction that has been observed being honest about what they know. What is known is that the Deceiver's core nature is manipulation toward ends that serve the Deceiver's interests. Its current interests presumably include freedom from the Tesseract prison its current shard occupies. They presumably also include access to the life energies of living beings, which is the C'tan's fundamental hunger. And they may very well include the eventual reassembly of the Deceiver into something closer to its original form. Whether this is achievable, whether the shards of any given C'tan can actually be recombined in a meaningful way, is not definitively established in the lore. But the Deceiver is exactly the kind of entity that would have been working on this problem for as long as it has been conscious of the problem, which is a very long time. The ultimate horizon of all the threads we've traced throughout this video, all the sleeping gods and imprisoned shards and pylon networks and ancient betrayals, is something you can only really see if you zoom out far enough to see the whole picture at once. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is a place where the largest single threat may not be the Chaos Gods, for all their terrible power. It may not be the Tyranids, despite their incomprehensible biological appetite. It may not even be the slow entropy of the Imperium collapsing under the weight of 10,000 years of stagnation and corruption. The largest single threat may be the awakening of something that was supposed to stay asleep. Because everything the Necrons are doing, everything the C'tan shards are scheming within their prisons, everything the Silent King is carefully managing and misdirecting, is happening on the surface of a much deeper process. The C'tan are not gone. They are not defeated. They are imprisoned, which is a very different thing. And the longer the Necrons are awake, the more tomb worlds are active, the more battlefield deployments of C'tan shards occur, the more Cryptek experiments probe the edges of Tesseract technology, the closer the galaxy moves to a situation that the war in heaven was supposed to have ended permanently. The Necrons broke their gods, but they couldn't quite finish the job. And 60 million years later, in tombs scattered across a galaxy full of life that has no idea what's buried beneath its foundations. The pieces of those gods are waking up and remembering what they were. The question of what they'll do about it, whether they'll be held, whether the Necrons' careful management will continue to contain them, whether the Silent King's plan will succeed, or whether it will create conditions that make containment impossible, is one of the most compelling, unresolved questions in the entire Warhammer 40,000 narrative. And it's unresolved because Games Workshop has been very deliberately keeping that door ajar, rather than slamming it shut, letting the players and the readers feel the cold draft from what might be on the other side, without yet committing to opening it fully. What we do know is this. Beneath Mars, something breathes in a manner of speaking. The slow electromagnetic rhythms of a sleeping god leaking through the walls of a prison the Emperor himself constructed. In tesseract labyrinths across 1,000 tomb worlds, shards of shattered deities rage in their confinement, planning with the patience of entities to whom millions of years feel like a long afternoon. In the intergalactic void, a hollow planet drifts on a course that is slowly, over millions of years, curving back toward the galaxy's edge, carrying within it a consciousness made of the consumed minds of dozens of gods, sane enough to steer and mad enough to want to return. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is being built on the bones of something that died 60 million years ago, but didn't quite finish dying. And the creatures who remember that fact best, who lived through it, and carry it in their cold metal memories across impossible years, are the ones quietly digging those bones back up. There's a thing the Necron tier used to say, back when they were still flesh and blood and frightened and alive. They built their greatest monuments for the dead, not the living, because only the dead had any permanence in a world that was always trying to kill you. They were right about permanence. They just didn't fully understand what they were building the monuments for. The C'tan are not gone. They are waiting. And the galaxy, for all its wars and its heroes and its gods and its empires, is doing what it has always done around those who are truly patient. It is giving them time. If you made it this far, genuinely thank you. This is the kind of lore that rewards sitting with it, turning it over, letting the implications settle. The Necrons are one of my favorite factions in this setting precisely because every layer you pull back reveals something older and more unsettling underneath, and the C'tan are the oldest and most unsettling layer of all. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel do more of exactly this kind of deep dive content. And leave a comment below, not just where you're watching from, but which C'tan keeps you up at night. Is it the Void Dragon beneath Mars? The Nightbringer whose face you already carry in your head, whether you want to or not? The Outsider in its hollow planet, slowly turning back toward home? Or something else? Because the galaxy is full of things that were supposed to stay sleeping, and some of them are starting to stir. End of script. Expanded Section 1 Addendum. The nature of C'tan consciousness. There is something worth dwelling on a little longer before we move fully forward through the Necron tier story, and that's the question of what C'tan consciousness actually was like in those billions of years before physical contact. Because the temptation when we describe the C'tan is to project a kind of malevolence onto them that they did not, at this early stage, actually possess. The C'tan were not evil in the early universe. They were not cruel. They were not scheming. They were, in the most literal possible sense, incapable of any of those things, because evil and cruelty and scheming all require a conception of other minds and the choices available to them. An entity that feeds on the radiation of a star and whose consciousness operates across timescales of millions of years and whose awareness of the material universe extends no further than the electromagnetic output of whatever sun it currently inhabits does not experience anything you or I would recognize as an agenda. They were more like weather than like people. Vast, ancient, unconscious, in anything we would recognize as the meaningful sense, drifting through the cosmos with all the moral weight of a hurricane. Hurricanes are terrible. Hurricanes kill people. Hurricanes destroy coastlines and sink ships and erase communities. But hurricanes do not intend to do these things. They have no intention at all. They are the organized expression of physical forces following physical laws, and the destruction they cause is entirely incidental to the process of being what they are. This is what the C'tan were before contact. And this is why what happened afterward was particularly tragic in a structural sense, because the C'tan did not become cruel and hungry and predatory because they chose to. They became those things because contact with matter, with physicality, with the specific electromagnetic complexity of living biological beings, awakened capacities that had always been latent in their nature but had never had occasion to activate. The hunger was always there in some potential form. Living things simply provided the trigger. The galaxy that housed them was also, it's worth remembering, a genuinely beautiful place in this early period. The war in heaven hadn't happened yet. The chaos gods hadn't been created yet. The great civilizations of the old ones were at the peak of their careful, patient work of seeding and cultivating life across 100,000 worlds. The webway, that extraordinary extra-dimensional network threaded through the space between real space and the warp, connected inhabited systems across the galaxy in a network of near-instantaneous travel. Life was blossoming in a galaxy that was, by 41st millennium standards, almost serene. The old ones moved through this galaxy like patient gardeners. They were not without conflict in their ancient history, but by the time the Necron tier arrived at interstellar capability and began to encounter them, the old ones were something close to the apex of what a civilization could achieve, billions of years old. Masters of both material science and psychic power, able to shape genetics at the fundamental level, able to move between stars in moments, able to live as long as they chose to live and die as rarely as circumstances forced. They were not gods exactly, but from the perspective of a short-lived species dying under its own poisonous sun, the distinction was not particularly meaningful. The Old One's relationship with the C'tan, before the Necron tier brought the star gods' physical bodies, appears to have been a kind of cautious, professional coexistence. They were aware of each other's existence. They may have had some historical conflict in the distant past, as the Deceiver later claimed to Surek. They maintained a kind of mutual distance, the Old Ones pursuing their biological projects across the galaxy's inner regions, the C'tan drifting through the outer stars and the spaces between them, each operating in a domain the other did not particularly want. This equilibrium was, of course, what the Necron tier destroyed by giving the C'tan physical form. And it's worth noting that they didn't do so innocently. The Necron tier knew they were finding a weapon. They knew the C'tan were beings of immense, incomprehensible power. They knew that giving these things physical bodies and pointing them at the Old Ones was not a surgical strike, but the release of something that had been, until that moment, locked away behind the impracticality of its own formlessness. They did it anyway, because desperate species do desperate things. Because when you have been dying for as long as the Necron tier had been dying, under a sky that wants to kill you, fighting a war you cannot win, watching every generation of your children waste away before they're fully grown, you reach for the thing that might work even when everything in your rational mind is telling you that you cannot control what you're about to unleash. The C'tan gained bodies, and the universe has been paying for it ever since. Expanded Section 2. Addendum. The Culture of Death. It would be easy, and somewhat lazy, to describe the Necron tier as simply a miserable people defined entirely by their suffering. The truth is more interesting than that. Yes, they were dying. Yes, their civilization was built around death in ways that would seem pathological to a longer-lived species. Yes, their greatest architectural achievements were tombs, and their greatest cultural concerns were memorial and funerary in nature. But within those constraints, they had developed something genuinely rich. The Necron tier approach to art, the fragments of which can be inferred from the aesthetics of the tomb complexes they eventually built, was one that took the confrontation with mortality as its central subject, and found in that confrontation a kind of austere, angular beauty. Their monuments were designed not to pretend that death didn't happen, but to assert that what was created before death still mattered after it. This is, if you think about it, a more honest confrontation with mortality than most civilizations manage. Many cultures build monuments as a kind of negotiation with death, as if the grandeur of the structure can somehow retroactively extend the life of the person it commemorates. The Necron tier seemed to have understood, at a deep cultural level, that you couldn't negotiate. What you could do was make something that would outlast you so thoroughly that the maker and the made became inseparable in the eyes of history. Their science, particularly their materials science and their understanding of physics, was extraordinary. This is perhaps unsurprising for a species that had been forced by its environment to develop better and better radiation shielding and life support technologies, from practically its first emergence into anything recognizable as civilization. The Necron had a relationship with material technology that was almost intimate, born of the kind of necessity that either destroys you or makes you very, very good at something very specific. By the time they achieved interstellar travel, they were working with concepts in metallurgy and physics that would be ahead of most 41st millennium human technology, and they wrapped their ships in the first versions of what would become necrodermis, the living metal that is now synonymous with the Necron civilization. Their political system was complex, in ways that made their fragility understandable. The dynastic structure, the triarch, the constant tension between individual pharaons who each ruled their domains with absolute authority, and the overarching authority of the ruling council, was a system under perpetual strain. Everyone in power was either newly in power, recently losing power, or just died before they could consolidate the power they had. The wars of secession, those periodic civil conflicts that threatened to tear the empire apart, were partly the result of this structural instability, and partly the result of what happens to any society when the grief of constant loss is never fully processed and instead is stored in the form of political grievance. The Necron grieved for everything they lost, all the time, which meant they grieved for everything without pause, and grief that has nowhere to go becomes rage, and rage that has an appropriate target becomes war. The old ones were the appropriate target, eventually, both because they had something the Necron desperately wanted, and because going to war with them was the only thing that unified all the fractious dynasties long enough for the Triarch to stop worrying about the next secession. What this context gives us is a portrait of the Necrons, even in their current deathless metal state, as a people whose defining impulse is not really conquest or domination or any of the things we typically associate with the aggressive expansion of their awakened tomb worlds. Their defining impulse is, at the deepest possible level, the refusal to accept loss. They lost their souls. They lost their mortality, which sounds like a gain until you understand what mortality meant to them. They lost their culture, their art, their ability to grieve and love and create and die. They lost everything that made them the interesting, complex, flawed, beautiful species they were. And the thing about a people who have always refused to accept loss is that they will do whatever it takes to get back what was taken from them. This is why the Silent King's project of reversing biotransference is not simply personal guilt, not simply a ruler trying to atone for a mistake. It is the most fundamental expression of what the Necron always were, a people who refused to die, who built monuments so the dead would not be forgotten, who made alliances with gods to avoid the one thing they feared most, who are, 60 million years later, still refusing, still reaching for the thing they lost in those bio-furnaces. Still convinced that if they are patient enough, and clever enough, and persistent enough, they can get it back. The tragedy is that they might be right, and the price they're willing to pay to find out might be everything else in the galaxy. Expanded Section 3, Addendum, the Incorporeal Starlight Bridge. The account of how the Cetan physically crossed into material reality is one of those pieces of lore that reads differently depending on how much of the surrounding context you have. The fragments that survive, mostly through Aeldari records and the partial Necron archives available to the Adeptus Mechanicus, describe something called the Incorporeal Starlight Bridge. A structure, or perhaps a process, by which the diffuse electromagnetic consciousness of a Cetan in its natural state was gathered together, focused, and directed across the gap between its stellar home and a physical body waiting to receive it. Think about what this actually involved. A Cetan in its natural state might span distances measured in astronomical units. Its consciousness, if you want to call it that, is spread across millions of miles of electromagnetic field lines, operating at the speed of light across spatial distances that dwarf anything human-scale experience can comfortably process. To take this and compress it, to concentrate it, to draw it together into something small enough to fit inside a body that, while much larger than a human, was still operating at planetary rather than stellar scale, is an engineering challenge that makes even the most ambitious Mechanicus projects look like assembling furniture. the Necron tier managed it. This is worth pausing on. These are people who were dying of cancer under a badly behaved sun, who had been losing an interstellar war for centuries, who were politically fractious to the point of perpetual civil war. They also managed to construct the physical housing for a god, and the mechanism by which a god could be invited to inhabit it. This tells you something important about what the Necron tier were capable of when they were sufficiently motivated. Witnessing accounts of the actual crossing are few and heavily filtered through the mythological frameworks of whatever culture recorded them. What multiple sources agree on is the visual component. Those who were present for the first Cetan's crossing describe seeing something that doesn't translate well into mundane description. Translucent streamers of force moving through the air, catching the light of the star the Catan was leaving in ways that made them look like bridges of solidified sunlight. A sense of enormous presence arriving by degrees, the air itself becoming charged in a way that made hair stand up and metal tingle. And then, a sudden coalescence, a focusing, as the diffuse entity found the boundaries of its new necrodermis body and began the process of understanding what it meant to be constrained into a specific shape. The Nightbringer was the first across, and then, immediately, the killing began. What the Necron tier hadn't fully anticipated was the effect that physicality would have on a Cetan's appetite. In its stellar form, the Nightbringer fed on radiation. There was plenty of radiation. Feeding was essentially passive, a matter of existing in proximity to a star and absorbing what it emitted. This was the Cetan version of breathing, automatic, constant, not requiring any particular decision or action. The moment the Nightbringer had a physical body, it discovered that the electromagnetic emissions of living biological creatures were accessible to it in a way they had not been before. Life force. The specific quality of organized biological complexity that makes a living creature distinct from the inorganic matter around it. The Nightbringer had been surrounded by organic life on a dozen worlds without being able to access it, because without a physical body, there was no interface. Now there was. And the Nightbringer reached out and fed, and discovered that this tasted like nothing it had ever experienced before. Everything it had been consuming for billions of years seemed bland and thin and flat by comparison. The Necron tier, who had built the body and extended the invitation to cross, were the first meal. Whether the Nightbringer understood, in that first moment, that it was consuming the beings who had made contact with it, is impossible to know. The pledge of loyalty and service that the surviving Necron tier offered in exchange for the Nightbringer ceasing to consume them was accepted. Whether the Nightbringer accepted it because it understood the strategic value of having servants, or because the promised alternative, an entire galaxy of other species to consume, was simply more appealing than finishing off the small group in front of it, is a distinction the lore doesn't resolve. The other Cetan were invited across in sequence. Each had to be found. Each had to be given a body. Each had to go through the process of adjusting to physical reality and discovering the taste of life force. Some took to it with less immediate violence than the Nightbringer. Some were more deliberate, more strategic in how they approached this new world of matter and form. The Deceiver in particular seemed to arrive already, understanding its situation in a way that suggested it had been thinking about this moment for a long time, even before contact was established. And then, there was the Void Dragon. The accounts of the Void Dragon's arrival are different in tone from the others. Where the Nightbringer's crossing was marked by immediate violence, and the Deceiver's by a quality of strategic assessment, the Void Dragon's emergence into physical form was accompanied by something the Necron tier engineers who witnessed it described. In the fragments that have survived, as a period of intense focus on the body itself, not on the Necron tier around it. Not on the galaxy it was entering, but on the materials and mechanisms of its new housing, testing its properties, understanding how necrodermis worked at a fundamental level, working out, in the first moments of physical existence, precisely what it was capable of and what the limits of the material it was made from actually were. The Void Dragon's relationship with technology, with material science at the deepest possible level, was apparently present from the first moment it existed in physical form. This is the entity that is currently sleeping beneath Mars, and its interest in the mechanics of whatever it inhabits has apparently not diminished by millions of years of stasis. Expanded Section 5. Addendum. The Old Ones' Last Gifts. The Old Ones, as they watched their civilization slowly losing ground to the relentless Necron advance and the terrible hunger of the Citan, made choices in their final years that continue to shape the galaxy 60 million years later. We've mentioned the Eldari and the Orcs, but the specific details of what the Old Ones were trying to achieve in those last desperate years of the war, and why those choices had the consequences they did, deserve more careful examination. The Old Ones were fundamentally biologists. Their mastery of the warp and their mastery of genetics were intertwined, because the warp, in the 40,000 setting, responds to psychic complexity in ways that make highly developed consciousness and psychic power natural companions. A species engineered to be strongly psychically connected to the warp is also, by definition, a species that the Old Ones had shaped at the genetic level to interact with the Imperium in specific ways. This is what made their warrior species so dangerous to the Citan. The Khitan are creatures of the material universe. The warp is antithetical to their nature, in a way that almost nothing in the physical universe is. And the Old Ones' engineered species could reach into the warp and use its power as a weapon, which created a genuine counter to the Citan's physical supremacy. The Eldari, that the Old Ones created in the early stages of their counteroffensive, were designed with extraordinary psychic sensitivity built into their biology at the most fundamental level. Every Eldari has a soul, a psychic presence in the warp that is, by the standards of most species, vast and vivid. They perceive the warp directly in ways that most species can only access through the mediation of specialized individuals. They can shape it, channel it, use it as a medium for effects that range from subtle divination to catastrophic offensive power. The Old Ones built all of this deliberately. The Eldari were not naturally occurring creatures who happened to develop psychic gifts. They were designed as weapons who happened to develop a civilization of extraordinary sophistication on the side. The Orcs, the Krork, as they were originally called, were a different design philosophy entirely. Where the Eldari were refined, complex, individually powerful, but requiring significant development and culture to achieve their potential, the Krork were simple, robust, self-perpetuating in ways that removed the logistical challenges of maintaining a standing army. The fungal biology that allows orcs to reproduce from spores spread across a battlefield means that an orc invasion, once started, is very difficult to fully extinguish. You cannot simply destroy the population. You have to destroy the spores, the mycelia, the entire biological infrastructure of a world, and even then, you might have missed some. The orcs' collective psychic field, the phenomenon that makes their poorly manufactured weapons function far better than any rational assessment of their construction would predict, was also a deliberate Old Ones design feature. Create a species whose belief in their own capability directly influences the performance of their equipment, and you have removed one of the most significant logistical bottlenecks in maintaining a military force. The tragedy of all of this is that the Old Ones were too late. The Krork were deployed. The Eldari were deployed. They fought. They drove the Necrons back in some theaters. The Citan's empire, facing for the first time a genuinely effective counter to its strengths, began to fracture, especially as the Citan turned on each other in their internal wars. But the momentum had swung too far, and the damage had been done in too many places for the Old Ones to recover from it. Their civilization, built over millions of years of patient cultivation, was dismantled, system by system, in a war that lasted so long that the concept of a time before the war became mythological for the species fighting in it. What the Old Ones left behind when they finally went, whether into death or into some form of retreat from the galaxy that amounts to the same thing in practice, was a legacy that continues to shape the 41st millennium in ways that most of the current inhabitants of the galaxy don't fully understand. The Eldari, who inherited the webway and expanded it into the greatest transit network in galactic history. The Orcs, who spread to virtually every habitable world in the galaxy, ensuring that wherever there is matter and radiation, there will eventually be orcs, consuming resources and fighting everything they encounter. The webway itself, that miracle of Old Ones, engineering, threaded through the gap between real space and the immaterium, now damaged and partially collapsed, but still the most efficient transit network available to those who can access it. And the warp changed permanently. charged with the psychic residue of millions of years of total war. The currents that had been building in the Imperium since the Old Ones first began creating psychically gifted species had, by the end of the war in heaven, grown strong enough that something was inevitable. Not the Chaos Gods as we know them in the 41st millennium, not yet. But the conditions that would eventually produce the Chaos Gods were firmly in place. The war in heaven built the stage. Everything that came after just performed on it. Expanded Section 6, Addendum. The mechanisms of shattering. The weapons the Necrons used to shatter the Cetan are described in the sources with enough consistent detail to give a sense of what they were, even if the exact mechanics remain appropriately opaque. They were devices that focus the fundamental energies of the material universe, the forces that govern matter and physics at the most basic level, into beams or pulses specifically calibrated to affect the electromagnetic consciousness that constituted a Cetan. Not conventional energy weapons, which would simply be absorbed by a Cetan the way they absorbed stellar energy. Something that worked differently, that attacked the organizing principles of Cetan consciousness rather than the raw electromagnetic substrate. The Necrons had spent millions of years as the Cetan's servants and instruments. They had watched their gods fight. They had been ordered to support Cetan in combat, and had done so, which meant they had observations about what the Cetan were vulnerable to that most other species in the galaxy did not possess. The war in heaven had also required them to develop technologies capable of affecting things at the same fundamental scale the Cetan operated at, and some of those technologies turned out to be adaptable. The Necrons are, by the 41st millennium standards, the most technologically sophisticated material civilization in the galaxy. In the context of the war in heaven, at the height of their scientific development, their ability to engineer a weapon capable of affecting a Cetan is not implausible. It is actually consistent with what we know they were capable of. What happened when these weapons struck a Cetan was not clean or simple. The Cetan were not simply cut into pieces the way you might cut a piece of metal. The shattering was more analogous to what happens when you apply catastrophic stress to a crystalline structure. The Cetan's electromagnetic consciousness, organized into the specific patterns that constituted its identity and will, was disrupted in ways that caused it to break along its own internal fault lines. Each resulting fragment carried a portion of the original's electromagnetic structure, which is why each shard retains something of the original's consciousness and power. But the organizing principles that made the original entity coherent, that held all the fragments in relation to each other in a single unified intelligence, were disrupted. The shards are not the original. They are resonances of it, echoes, each one convinced it is the whole, but lacking the wider context that the whole possessed. This has an interesting implication for the question of whether Cetan shards can be recombined. The technical problem is not simply gathering the physical fragments and putting them in proximity. It is restoring the organizing principles of the original consciousness, the specific patterns of electromagnetic relationship between the shards that constituted the Cetan's unified identity. This is almost certainly not something that happens simply by putting enough shards together. It would require technology capable of reconstructing those patterns, which is either impossibly complex or which the Necron's cryptechs are quietly working toward, or both. The Tesseract labyrinths themselves are marvels of engineering. They create a pocket-dimensional space that has specific properties calibrated to contain Cetan shards. The interior of a Tesseract labyrinth is not accessible in any normal spatial sense. It exists in a fold of the material universe that is separate from normal space-time, large enough to contain an active Cetan shard, and bounded by walls made of manipulated physics rather than any conventional material. The shard inside is aware of the walls. It tests them, constantly. Every moment it is conscious, which is every moment it exists, it is applying its remaining power to the problem of finding a flaw in the containment. The Necrons know this. This is why deploying Cetan shards in battle is always a calculated risk. You open the labyrinth just enough to direct the shard's aggression outward at an enemy, relying on the fact that a Canoptech Sentinel and the controlling systems of the labyrinth can maintain the connection and pull the shard back before it achieves escape velocity. In practice, this works most of the time. In practice is not the same as every time. Expanded Section 7 Addendum, the Deceiver's Long Game. Mephit Ran the Deceiver is the Cetan that most consistently defies simple characterization. The Nightbringer is the embodiment of death. The Void Dragon is the embodiment of technological dominion. The Outsider is the embodiment of madness. The Deceiver is the embodiment of a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. What does an intelligence of almost unlimited patience and no verifiable loyalty actually want? In the old pre-5th edition lore, the Deceiver was presented as one of the 4 great surviving Cetan, still active in the galaxy, orchestrating events from behind countless layers of disguise and false identity. This presented the Deceiver as an active, present threat in the 41st millennium, in a way that made it distinct from the largely imprisoned or sleeping status of the other major Cetan. The 5th edition's introduction of the shard concept somewhat complicated this picture, but the core truth remains. The Deceiver's shards are more active, more strategically coherent, and more willing to operate through manipulation rather than direct force than the shards of any other Cetan. This is consistent with the Deceiver's nature before the shattering, and it suggests that whatever passed for the Deceiver's core personality is distributed across its shards more effectively than the personalities of the other Catan. The destruction of the Blackstone fortresses, or the Talismans of Vol as the Eldari call them, is the Deceiver's most documented achievement in the current era. The Blackstone fortresses were ancient weapons created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven, specifically to counter the Cetan. They were designed to destroy Cetan on their emergence, to be turned against the Star Gods the moment the Necron-Cetan alliance showed its true colors. The Eldari, as heirs to the Old One's legacy, had preserved several of these weapons over the millions of years since the War in Heaven, maintaining them as a last resort option against the possibility that the Cetan might somehow return. The Deceiver arranged for them to be destroyed before the Eldari could use them. The exact mechanism of this achievement is not fully documented, which is appropriate. The Deceiver's most effective operations are the ones nobody can quite reconstruct afterward. What this tells us about the Deceiver's agenda is significant. It is not simply trying to escape its current imprisonment. It is actively working to remove the tools that other species might use to destroy it if it did escape. This is long-term planning of a kind that suggests the Deceiver has a clear sense of the situation and a clear set of priorities. First priority: ensure that the galaxy's most dangerous anti-Catan weapons are unavailable. Second priority, presumably, create conditions for the Cetan's return to power. Third priority: whatever the Cetan's fundamental goals actually are once the constraints have been removed. The Deceiver's interactions with the Necrons in the current era are also notable. Unlike most Cetan shards, which are deployed as battlefield weapons and spend the rest of their time in Tesseract containment, Deceiver shards have on multiple occasions been documented operating outside of direct Necron control. Not escaped, exactly. More as if the containment is being managed with more flexibility than strict imprisonment would suggest. Whether this is deliberate Necron policy, the result of specific overlords maintaining a more cooperative relationship with their Deceiver shards than is standard practice, or the result of the Deceiver's shards simply being too clever to be managed with ordinary Tesseract technology, varies by account. What none of the accounts dispute is that the Deceiver is active, it is watching, it is planning, and whatever it is planning has been in development for long enough that the first stages of its execution may already be complete. Expanded, Section 8, Addendum, the Emperor and the Dragon. The relationship between the Emperor of Mankind and the Void Dragon is one of the most tantalizing mysteries in the entire 40,000 setting, partly because it tells us something specific about what the Emperor was capable of before the heresy and the Golden Throne changed the terms of his existence, and partly because it raises questions about the Emperor's knowledge and motives that are not comfortable to look at directly. The Emperor of Mankind is, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most powerful psychic entities in human history, born at a moment when thousands of shamans and psychic elders of ancient human tribes chose to simultaneously sacrifice themselves to concentrate their accumulated psychic power into a single new being. The Emperor arrived in the physical universe already possessed of capabilities that dwarfed virtually anything any other human psyker has achieved before or since. He has been active, in one form or another, for tens of thousands of years, and in that time has had opportunities to encounter things that most humans would not survive long enough to report on. His encounter with the Void Dragon is dated to some time before the Age of Strife, which means it occurred before the 25th millennium of the imperial calendar. The details are fragmentary and filtered through multiple layers of myth and classified record, but the core of the account is consistent. The Emperor met the Void Dragon, presumably somewhere in the region of what would eventually become Mars. They fought. The Emperor won, or at least achieved enough of an upper hand to imprison the dragon rather than being consumed by it. He then, apparently, brought the dragon to Mars and placed it in confinement beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus. Why Mars? This is the question that generates the most interesting speculation. The Void Dragon's technological affinity, its passive influence on the mechanical minds of humans who inhabited Mars over subsequent millennia, its connection to the Mechanicus faith in the machine god, these could all be happy accidents of geography. He imprisoned the dragon where he fought it, and Mars happened to be nearby. But the account preserved by the Guardian adept Semyon suggests something more deliberate, that the Emperor specifically chose Mars, that the dragon's influence on Mars was not an accident to be managed, but a resource to be cultivated, that the Adeptus Mechanicus was not simply an organization the Emperor made alliance with for practical reasons, but one he helped shape, at least in part, by arranging for the dragon's sleeping influence to inspire exactly the kind of technological development he needed. If this is true, then the Emperor of Mankind used a sleeping Cetan as a technological inspiration engine for his most important industrial and military partner. He built the Imperium's scientific and manufacturing capacity on the dreams of an imprisoned god, and he did so knowing what the dragon was, which means he accepted the risk that this entailed. What risk? The risk that the dragon would wake up. The risk that the containment would fail, either through damage to the containment systems or through the dragon's own efforts, and that whatever the dragon chose to do upon waking would occur right in the heart of the Imperium's most important industrial planet. The risk that the Mechanicus, who had built their entire theological and cultural framework around worshipping something they didn't know was a Cetan, might react to its emergence in ways that did not benefit the Imperium. The Emperor presumably calculated that this risk was worth the reward, that the technological development inspired by the dragon's passive influence was worth more to the long-term survival of humanity than the risk of the dragon eventually waking and doing what Cetan do. Whether he was right is a calculation that, in the current era of the 41st millennium, is getting closer to being tested. The 5 Necron cruisers that penetrated Mars's defenses in 998 of the 41st millennium and made landfall near the Noctis Labyrinthus were destroyed before they could achieve whatever their objective was. But they demonstrated something important. The Necrons know the dragon is there. They know where, specifically on Mars, it is being held. And they have the capability and apparently the motivation to reach it. What the Necrons want to do with the dragon is not established. The possibilities range from wanting to assess its status and ensure it is still contained, the most optimistic reading, to wanting to communicate with it, suggesting some residual relationship between Necron interests and Cetan interests that the shattering didn't fully resolve, to wanting to free it for reasons that Necron leaders may find compelling, but that would be catastrophic for the Imperium. The Guardian of the Dragon, Dahlia Cythera, the perpetual the Emperor placed to watch over the dragon's prison, has been doing her work for tens of thousands of years. She is, presumably, still doing it. Whether the bindings she maintains are still intact, whether the dragon's slow awakening over millennia of Mechanicus worship has brought it close to a threshold that the original containment was not designed to handle, is not information the lore makes available. The question is open. The door is not fully closed. Expanded section, 9 Addendum, Dynasties and Their Agendas. The complexity of the Necron Great Awakening is not simply military and strategic. It is also deeply political in the internal sense, because the Necrons, who are waking up, did not all go to sleep with the same priorities, and are not all waking up with the same agendas. The Sautek dynasty, led by Imhotep the Stormlord, is perhaps the most aggressive of the currently active major dynasties. Imhotep's approach to reconquest is essentially direct. The Sautek emerged from the Great Sleep more intact than most dynasties, which means they have more of their military capacity operational, which means they have the luxury of pursuing an aggressive forward posture. Imhotep commands the weather of planets he fights on. He is one of the most decorated tactical geniuses among the awakened Necron lords, and his campaigns of conquest have been consistent, methodical, and effective. He is not subtle. He does not need to be. The Nihiloc dynasty is almost the opposite. Territorial, isolationist, obsessed with recovering exactly what they had before the Great Sleep, and not one star more. The Nihiloc are the Necron lords, who most clearly remember what they had and most urgently want exactly that thing back, rather than general galactic domination. They will fight viciously to protect what they identify as their territory. They are considerably less interested in anything else. The Mefrit dynasty are the stellar executioners. Before the Great Sleep, they were known for deploying weapons of astronomical scale, devices capable of destroying stars as military tactics. When they woke, they discovered that these weapons were gone, lost or destroyed in the 60 million years of stasis. This loss appears to have generated a particular kind of institutional rage in the Mefrit, who are now engaged in something that reads like a galaxy-spanning search for what happened to their most prized military capabilities. Then there are the stranger dynasties. The Novak, known for close-quarters combat and a warrior culture that has more in common with the most aggressive Space Marine chapters than with the usual Necron preference for methodical distance engagements. The Thocht, with their blue-green energy signatures and their somewhat more internally fractured political situation. And the Saracon, the Silent King's own dynasty, which he has apparently fully activated as the most technologically sophisticated dynasty in existence, and is using as the primary force for constructing the contra-empiric pylon network. The Saracon's specific role in Sarek's plan is worth dwelling on. The Codex materials establish that the Saracon dynasty was always the most adept at working with Blackstone, the Noctilith material from which the Necron pylons are made. This was apparently a function of their position in the original Necron Empire as the ruling dynasty, giving them access to the most advanced technomandrite expertise. After 60 million years of additional isolation, and whatever project Sarek was working on in the intergalactic void, the Saracon's capabilities in this area are apparently still unmatched. The Pariah Nexus, that zone of suppressed warp activity that the Necrons have established in a significant stretch of space, represents the first large-scale test of what the fully activated contra-empiric network can do. The effects within the Pariah Nexus are measurable and disturbing. Human populations within the Nexus suffer from a progressive loss of will. Not dramatic madness, not horrifying transformation. Just a slow, creeping erosion of the motivational structures that make human civilization function. People stop caring. They stop resisting. They lose the capacity for strong emotion and meaningful intention that makes humans capable of both the best and worst things they do. They become, in a word, docile, manageable, available. The Necrons are not doing this because they enjoy it. They're testing whether a large-scale suppression of warp interaction can produce the conditions Sarek's cryptechs need to work on the biotransference reversal project. The goal is not a galaxy full of empty husks. The goal is a galaxy full of biologically intact organic creatures that are calm enough to be used as experimental subjects, while the Necrons figure out how to extract a soul from the warp and put it back into a metal body. The fact that this is monstrous does not seem to factor into the Silent King's calculations in any significant way, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Sarek as a character. He is not evil in the way that chaos is evil, which is to say, he does not derive pleasure from suffering or seek destruction as an end in itself. He is the ruler of a people who were robbed of their souls 60 million years ago, and he is willing to do whatever it takes to give those souls back, because he is the one who agreed to the bargain that took them in the first place. Whether the people in the Pariah Nexus matter to him in any meaningful moral sense is not something the lore gives you a reassuring answer to. Expanded section. 10 addendum. The question of recombination. Sitting underneath every discussion of the Satan shards is a question that the lore keeps carefully leaving unanswered. Can they be put back together? The technical arguments against recombination being straightforward are substantial. As we discussed earlier, the shattering did not simply divide the Satan into pieces. It disrupted the organizing principles that constituted their coherent identity. Each shard is a resonance of the original, carrying some of its power and some of its characteristics, but not the original's full organizational framework. Recombination would not simply be a matter of bringing enough shards into proximity. It would require something capable of reimposing the organizing framework, of reconstructing the specific electromagnetic patterns that made the C'tan a unified consciousness, rather than a collection of powerful but individually incomplete fragments. This is either impossible with currently available technology, or it is the most closely guarded research project in the galaxy. The character of Necrosaur Amintar and his collection of Nightbringer shards is interesting precisely because it might be testing the limits of the impossible side of this question. Multiple shards of the Nightbringer are being gathered by this particular destroyer cultist, and the accounts of his behavior suggest he believes that assembling enough of them will produce something qualitatively different from the individual shards. Whether this is a technologically informed theory or the wishful thinking of a Necron who has been spending too much time in proximity to imprisoned C'tan energy, is a distinction that may not matter if enough shards are in one place. The Nightbringer shards are described as having a degree of influence over Amintar. This is worth being specific about. The influence is not simply the natural consequence of proximity to something immensely powerful. The shards appear to be shaping Amintar's decisions in specific directions, encouraging particular courses of action that serve the shard's interests. If you accept that the shards are not simply inert fragments of power, but actively conscious pieces of a formerly unified entity, this makes sense. The Nightbringer wants to be reassembled. A portion of its recovered cognitive ability is being directed toward manipulating the Necron, who is conveniently gathering its pieces. This would mean that Amintar believes he is the one in control of the project, when the C'tan shards are in fact managing him. Which is exactly the kind of situation the original C'tan would have engineered, and exactly the kind of long-term manipulation that would be consistent with whatever remnants of C'tan intelligence survive in the shards. Similar dynamics may be playing out elsewhere in the galaxy, with Necron leaders who believe they are strategically deploying C'tan shards actually operating within parameters the shards have subtly shaped. This is speculative, but it's the kind of speculation that the lore actively encourages you toward. The Necrons think they control the C'tan. The C'tan, or what remains of them, may have a different perspective on this relationship. The Deceiver's shards, as noted, have already demonstrated that they can operate with more independence than the containment model suggests is normal. If the Deceiver is actively working to reconstruct itself from its scattered pieces, and if it is doing so while maintaining the appearance of operating within Necron-controlled parameters, this is exactly the kind of project it would be capable of running. Patient, invisible, accumulating pieces toward a critical threshold without any individual move being large enough to trigger an alarm. What happens if a C'tan is fully recombined is a question the 41st millennium has not yet had to answer. The War in Heaven showed what C'tan operating at full capacity were capable of: stars extinguished, star systems devoured, the fundamental physical laws of local space bent to serve their purposes. A fully restored C'tan in the current galaxy, with 60 million years of Necron military development around it that it didn't have access to in the War in Heaven, with the psychic species of the galaxy in a weakened state compared to the peak of the Old Ones' engineering, with the Old Ones themselves gone and their most effective counterweapons destroyed, would be something the galaxy has not faced since the War in Heaven ended. There would be no Old Ones to engineer countermeasures. The Aeldari, who have the deepest institutional knowledge of the C'tan and their capabilities, are reduced to a fraction of their former numbers. Humanity does not know enough to respond effectively. Even the Space Marines, perhaps the most capable military force of the human side of the setting, operate at a scale that is simply insufficient to engage a fully powered C'tan. Their bolters fire bolts of metal-cased explosive at supersonic velocities. A C'tan can extinguish suns. The only thing in the current galaxy that might present a serious counter to a fully restored C'tan would be other C'tan, which is not a reassuring thought. Closing thoughts. The patience of the dead. There is a line in the Necron Codex materials that has always struck me as one of the most perfectly calibrated pieces of writing in the 40,000 setting. It describes the Necron legions as a force that will endure past the current troubles of the Imperium, past the burning eyes of the Chaos Gods, past the slow consumption of the Tyranids, past every war and every empire and every civilization that currently believes itself to be a significant player in the galaxy's story, until the time comes to simply step forward and take possession of what was always theirs. This is the essence of the Necron threat, and it's the thing that makes them uniquely disturbing compared to every other major faction. The Chaos Gods are horrifying because they want your soul. The Tyranids are horrifying because they want your body. The Necrons are horrifying because they want the galaxy, not urgently, not desperately, but with the absolute patience of beings who have already waited 60 million years and are prepared to wait longer. They are not trying to win a war against you. They are waiting for you to become irrelevant. And they are very, very good at waiting. But what makes this even more unsettling is what they are doing while they wait. The pylons going up. The Pariah Nexus expanding. The Satan shards being carefully managed in their prisons, while something in those prisons quietly presses at the walls. The dragon breathing in its cage beneath Mars, and the Mechanicus devotedly worshipping it without knowing what they're worshipping. The outsider in its hollow planet, turning slowly back toward the galaxy's edge. The Necrons are not simply trying to wake themselves up. They are trying to reshape the terms of existence in the galaxy so that waking up means something specific, something that serves the Silent King's long-term plan for his people's redemption. And woven through that plan, like a thread that was never fully cut, are the Satan. Still there, still conscious, still feeding on whatever is available to them, still waiting for the opportunity that 60 million years of imprisonment has done nothing to diminish their desire for. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But the oldest combatants in that war did not need the war to be happening to be dangerous. They only need the patience to wait and the power to act when the moment comes. And some of them have been waiting since before the first planets cooled. Thank you for spending this time with some of the deepest and most extraordinary lore in the 40,000 setting. If this kind of deep exploration is what you come here for, subscribing really does help make sure you see more of it. So please consider it. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is, and which thread in all of this keeps pulling at you most. Is it the dragon beneath Mars? The outsider in the dark? The Silent King's desperate plan? The shards in their prisons, planning? Because the galaxy of the 41st millennium is built on old bones, and the bones are starting to rattle. The flare curse and the tragedy of the living dead. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we fully close, and it concerns not the cosmic horror of the Satan, but the very human, very intimate horror that lives inside every Necron warrior. We've talked at length about what the Necrons are trying to wake up, in terms of external threats, sleeping gods, and imprisoned shards, and the potential catastrophe of restoration. But there is also the question of what is asleep inside the Necrons themselves. The majority of Necron warriors, those rank-and-file metal skeletons that march across the battlefields of the 41st millennium in implacable green-glowing advance, retain very little of the Necrontyr they once were. The biotransference process stripped most of the ordinary warriors and soldiers and civilians of the Necrontyr Empire of virtually everything that constituted them as individuals. They follow orders. They fight effectively. They reassemble themselves when damaged. That terrifying reanimation protocol that makes killing a Necron warrior feel like pushing water uphill, but they do not dream. They do not remember their children or their parents or the taste of food or the feeling of warmth from a fire. They are, in the truest possible sense, hollow. The Necron nobles retain more. The overlords and pharaons and lords who command the dynasties are, in many cases, beings of genuine personality and cognition. Some are arrogant and dismissive. Some are curious and collect things obsessively. Some are brilliantly strategic. Some are genuinely philosophical about their situation. The Codex materials for recent editions have put significant effort into establishing that the Necron leadership are not simply uniform villains, but individuals with complex interiorities, each shaped by the specific way the biotransference process interacted with their particular pre-existing character. But even the nobles are diminished from what they were. The richness of organic emotional experience, the full-spectrum complexity of a consciousness that was born, grew, loved, feared, grieved, and died, This is compressed and simplified in ways that the noble Necrons can sense, but cannot fully articulate. They remember having been something more. They cannot quite reconstruct what that something more felt like, but the absence is palpable, like trying to remember a dream that keeps slipping away the harder you try to hold it. The flayed ones, those disturbing Necron warriors who drape themselves in the organic tissue of their kills, are the most visible expression of this interior loss. The Flayer curse that Landugor inflicted on the Necrons at the moment of its destruction was not simply a physical affliction. It was a psychic wound, an echo of the Citan's own consuming hunger imprinted onto the Necron population. Necrons afflicted by the Flayer curse are overcome by a compulsion to touch organic material, to wrap themselves in it, to try to feel through it whatever it was like to have flesh. They are not trying to consume the living in any nutritional sense. They are trying, in the most tragic and repulsive way possible, to remember what it felt like to be alive. This is a horror story, not of monsters, but of the lost. Whatever was once a Necrontyr warrior, a person who had parents and a home and a life that they lost too early to a sun that was trying to kill them, is now an eternal machine wrapped in someone else's skin, unable to process or explain the compulsion that drives it to do this, unable to feel the comfort it is seeking, unable to stop. The flayed ones are what happens when the desperate longing for lost mortality goes wrong in the worst possible direction. And the Necrons, despite the fact that any Necron could theoretically be afflicted by the Flayer virus under the right circumstances, have no cure for it. They manage it. They quarantine it. They use the flayed ones in battle when possible, deploying their nightmarish appearance as a psychological weapon, but they cannot fix it. The Flayer curse is the dead Citan Landugor's final statement. Even from obliteration, even from absolute destruction, a Citan managed to leave a permanent mark on the species that destroyed it. This is what the Necrons are living with. Every dynasty, every tomb world, every awakened Pharaon and silent warrior. The consequences of choices that were made 60 million years ago and can never be fully undone. The hollow where the soul was, the metal that replaced the flesh. The cage that was supposed to be salvation and turned out to be the most elaborate and inescapable prison in galactic history. And somewhere in all of that, in the cold machinery of the Necron civilization and the sleeping horrors they carry with them, like passengers in Tesseract cages, there is still something reaching for what it lost. Sarek, crossing the intergalactic void alone for 60 million years, carrying the guilt of a species. The Necrontyr ghost still resident in each warrior, too faint to assert itself, but too stubborn to fully disappear. The dream, however distant and dim and possibly impossible, of reclaiming the thing that was taken. This is what the Necrons are actually trying to wake up. Not just their legions, not just their gods. The memory of what they were before the gods devoured them. The possibility that something of the Necrontyr still survives inside the Necrons. That the 60 million years of sleep have not erased it entirely. That when they finally wake in full, when every tomb world is open and every dynasty is active and the galaxy understands what it is dealing with, there might still be something there that could, someday, be called alive. Whether that's hope or tragedy depends on how much of the galaxy has to be subjugated to find out. The Necrons sleep no longer. The galaxy is waking to find them standing in its doorway. And behind them, in their cages and their prisons and their hollow planet at the edge of the void, the things they broke but could not quite destroy are stirring. 60 million years of darkness. 60 million years of waiting. And the thing about beings who have been waiting that long is that they have had a very long time to plan what they're going to do when the waiting stops. Sleep well. A note on Awakens, the diviner. There is one more character in the Necron story who deserves a moment, because he sits at the intersection of everything this script has covered. Awakens the diviner is the Necrontyr astrologer who warned the Silent King not to accept the deceiver's offer of biotransference. He was ignored, he was right, and he has spent 60 million years being right about it, while being unable to do anything meaningful with that rightness. Awakens is unusual among Necrons, in that his function as a diviner, a reader of cosmic patterns and probabilistic futures, apparently gave him a form of cognitive engagement that biotransference did not fully flatten. He retained more of himself than most Necrons of his rank, partly because his specific mental discipline proved robust against the homogenizing effect of the transfer. He is, in the 41st millennium, one of the most individually characterized of the Necron characters, possessed of a furious pride in his own predictive abilities, and a profound contempt for those who fail to listen to predictions that turn out to be accurate. He also appears, in some accounts, to have been running his own experiments on the nature of Necron consciousness and its relationship to the warp and the missing soul substance consumed by the Cetan. His interest in time and prediction gives him a unique angle on the biotransference problem, and while no specific solution is attributed to him, his research is noted as being in territory that makes other Necron scholars uncomfortable. Whether this discomfort is justified, whether Awakens has found something in the mathematics of prediction that has implications for the Soul Recovery Project, is a question the lore has been building toward without yet answering. What Awakens represents in the story, beyond his individual character, is the persistence of the Necron tier at their most intellectually alive inside the machinery of the Necron. He was someone who thought deeply, who saw patterns others missed, who understood consequences others ignored. That person survived, imperfectly, through the worst process that has ever been inflicted on any species. That he is still thinking, still seeing patterns, still furious that no one listened when they should have, feels like an important signal. The Necron are not entirely gone. They persist in the most stubborn of ways, in the minds of those few who were strong enough, or strange enough, or simply fortunate enough to hold on to something essential when everything else was taken. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is, in a sense, waiting to find out whether that persistence amounts to anything, whether there is enough left of the Necron tier inside the Necrons to reclaim what was lost, whether the project the Silent King has spent 60 million years pursuing in secret through guilt and patience and the slow construction of a galaxy-spanning infrastructure will ever reach its conclusion. The answer may already be unfolding. The pylons are going up. The shards are in their cages and thinking. The dragon breathes beneath Mars, and in the dark beyond the galaxy's edge, a hollow planet turns. The dead, as it turns out, are very much awake. The Tesseract Labyrinth, engineering the impossible. Before we close entirely, it is worth spending a little more time on the Tesseract Labyrinth itself, because this piece of technology is so central to everything we have discussed, and its existence raises questions about the Necron's capabilities that have direct implications for the question of what might happen if those capabilities were ever pushed to their limit. A Tesseract Labyrinth is, in engineering terms, a pocket dimension. It is a volume of manipulated space-time, separated from the main body of the material universe by a barrier constructed from applied physics rather than from any material. The interior of a Tesseract Labyrinth exists outside of normal four-dimensional space, which means that what goes in cannot come out through any conventional interaction with the surrounding universe. The only interface points between the inside and the outside are the specific portals built into the device's structure, which are under the direct control of the Necrons operating it. The size of the interior space of a Tesseract Labyrinth is, according to the principles being described, theoretically adjustable. You are not constrained by the physical dimensions of the outer device. A Tesseract Labyrinth can be the size of a human fist on the outside, while maintaining an interior volume large enough to contain an active Cetan shard, which is itself significantly larger than human scale when fully expressing its electromagnetic presence. The laws of scale that govern normal space do not apply inside a pocket dimension. This is also why the containment works as well as it does. The Cetan shard inside a Tesseract Labyrinth is not pressing against the walls of a conventional cell. It is pressing against a boundary that is made of manipulated physics, against the fundamental rules by which the Cetan's electromagnetic nature interacts with the space it occupies. Breaking through this boundary would require the shard to achieve a kind of physical law violation that its available power cannot quite sustain indefinitely, especially when the boundary is being actively maintained by the Necron technology managing the device. The key word there is actively maintained. The Tesseract Labyrinth is not a passive prison. It requires ongoing power input and ongoing algorithmic management to keep the boundaries stable. This is part of why the Necrons cannot simply store all their Cetan shards in a vault somewhere and forget about them. They require continuous management, continuous power, continuous attention. which means they are also continuously present in the consciousness of the cryptechs managing them, which means that any plan the shards have to affect conditions on the outside requires nothing more than influencing the minds of the beings who are already paying close attention to them. The intelligence required to run a sustained influence operation on the Necrons managing your prison, while simultaneously appearing to comply with the containment parameters well enough not to trigger any countermeasures, while accumulating small advantages over time toward an objective decades or centuries away, is exactly the kind of intelligence that the C'tan possessed before the shattering. Whether the shards retain enough of this intelligence to run such an operation is unclear. Whether they are currently doing so is something no Necron management team would have an obvious way to detect, given that the C'tan's influence would be designed to be imperceptible. This is the most intimate version of the sleeping horror at the heart of the Necron story. Not the dragon beneath Mars, not the outsider in its hollow world, not the possibility of galactic war when the Necrons fully awaken. The most intimate version is this: every Necron that has ever opened a Tesseract labyrinth, every cryptech who has maintained a C'tan containment device, every overlord who has decided to deploy a shard as a battlefield weapon, has been in a relationship with something that is much smarter than they have been comfortable acknowledging, and has been in that relationship in conditions of very close proximity for a very long time. The C'tan were gods once. They built the Necrons' bodies and consumed the Necrontyrs' souls. They were broken but not destroyed, imprisoned but not silenced, diminished but not dead. They are old beyond the meaning of the word old in any context that human beings normally deploy it. And they are patient in the way that only something which has been conscious since before the first planets formed can be patient. The Necrons won the war against their gods 60 million years ago. Whether they are winning the peace is a different question, and one the galaxy may not be able to afford the answer to.